One gusty day, upon returning from work, Jahan on Chota's neck, the master, and the apprentices inside the howdah, they found Taqi-uddin waiting in the courtyard, a troubled look on his face. Having not visited him in a while, Jahan was astonished to see how much he had changed. The excitement that had glossed his features in the early months of the observatory had worn off, leaving an older and gaunter face beset by tension. After a brief interchange of greetings, the two elderly men retreated into the pavilion in the garden, under a canopy of vines, their voices subdued, strained. Unable to get near, unwilling to stay away, the apprentices strode to the kitchen, where, despite the grumbling of the cook, they perched beside the window, the one spot in the house where they could spy on their masters. From this distance it was not possible to hear what they were saying. Even so, nothing could hold them back from making guesses of their own. "Something's wrong," murmured Davud. "I feel it in my bones." "Maybe they are only having a discussion," said Nicola, not ready to abandon his customary sanguineness. Taqi-uddin had brought along one of his acolytes, a young stargazer with a pockmarked face and the thinnest beard the color of sunset. When he joined them, the apprentices began to badger him, asking what was happening. Though he tried to evade their questions, he soon laid everything bare. "My master observed a comet in Sagittarius." Jahan cast a glance at the others. Nicola seemed confused, Davud suspicious. There was no way to tell what was on Sancha's mind, since her eyes were fixed on the floor. Assuming he was not the only ignorant one around, he asked, "What's that?" The stargazer sighed. "Long-haired star. Huge. It's coming our way." "What will it do?" Davud inquired. "My master will say." "Surely you must know something about this," Davud insisted. "Some comets have caused floods. In one kingdom all the women with child miscarried. Another time three-legged frogs rained from the sky." The apprentices listened aghast. Spurred on by his own voice, the man recounted one calamity after another. Another comet brought a dry spell that lasted for 7 years. Winds so strong that all the saplings were uprooted. Locusts devoured any plant that was left. "SSSH, they're coming," Nicola said, even though there was no way they could be heard from the outside. Embarrassed, not unlike badly behaved children, they went into the garden to welcome the two masters. Whatever it was that troubled Taqi-uddin seemed to have blighted Sinan's mood, like a canker that passes from one tree to the next. "Look at them," Taqi-uddin said, pointing at the apprentices. "Gossip flies faster than a comet," said Sinan in the waggish voice he reserved for fatherly reproach. "Particularly if someone can't hold their tongue," Taqi-uddin chided, his stare resting on his own acolyte, who instantly lowered his head, color rising to his cheeks. Quietly the astronomer added, "It's fine. The entire city will learn about it anyhow." Encouraged by this, Jahan demanded, "What does it all mean?" "Allah is great and so are his omens," Taqi-uddin said. "We mortals might not see it that way, but in the end it always is." Jahan stared at the court astronomer, tongue-tied. His answer, which offered scant comfort, had weighed him down. He wasn't the only one. Until that moment the apprentices had been more preoccupied with inventing menaces where they saw none. Now they felt threatened by a force they had neither the wisdom to grasp nor the might to defeat. Sinan was correct about the speed of gossip. In the ensuing days Istanbulites talked about nothing else. Fearful whispers and dark forebodings seeped into the cracks in the walls, filled in the gaps in the cobbles, passed through the holes in the locks, flew down the sewers, sullied the very air. Soon after, the Sultan declared he would hold a conclave of notables, viziers, and members of the ulama, an impromptu council where Taqiyuddin would give an account of things. Jahan's excitement soared when he heard that Sinan, too, had been asked to come and offer his opinion. "Please take me with you," Jahan pleaded. Sinan threw him a burning look. "Why, just because you are curious? If not me, take another one of us. We built this observatory." He didn't need to go on. Sinan yielded. "Go, get ready." After the midday prayer, the master and the mahout reached the palace. Like the others, they were ushered into the audience chamber. There were about 40 dignitaries, some of them with their attendants, lined up on both sides of the vast room. Sitting on a golden throne in the heart of everything was Sultan Murad. Taqiyuddin was brought in. Jahan watched him kneel and kiss the sultans hem, bow again, salute the members of the divan and wait demurely, his hands clasped, his gaze on his feet. In that moment no one wanted to be in his place. "Chief Royal Astronomer, you are here to tell our benevolent Sultan what the comet promises to bring," said the Grand Vizier Sokollu. "If your Highness permits," Taqiyuddin said, and took out a scroll from the inside of his robe. He began to read it aloud. "I, Taqiyuddin ibn Maruf, in my capacity as the Chief Royal Astronomer, have seen a comet in Sagittarius. After consulting Mizaj and making use of my Turkey, as the great Nasir al-Din al-Tasi had once done, I found its longitude to be at 26 Sagittarius and its latitude at 22 degrees north. In my measurements I have taken 3 major stars as my reference points: Aldebaran, the bullseye, Al-Ghurab, the raven, and Altair, the flying vulture. 4 days on end I have observed the motion of the comet to understand its temperament. The details of its progression I have written down at length for young astronomers to study after my soul departs this world of shadows." Here Taqiyuddin paused. Not a single sound could be heard in the chamber. "I slept little for the next 7 nights. My apprentices and I took turns studying." "Spare us what you have done," said Sokollu. "Tell us what the star will do." Taqiyuddin drew breath, as if imbibing this moment, this room. He took it in. The faces of friends and foes watching his every move, and perhaps he felt as lonely as the comet he had been tracking. Placing his finger on the scroll, he skipped to the end. "I've found that the comet is attracted by Venus, its tail stretches eastwards, its motion is from north to south. By studying the constitution of the comet and the temperament of the planet it is drawn to, I have come to the conclusion that, unlike the comets that have visited our skies in days of old, this one has a benevolent nature. It does not wish us harm." A quiet rumble of relief rose. Into this the Sultan, speaking for the first time, said with a bob of his head, "That's good. Tell us more." "It shall bring rain clouds aplenty, the harvest will overflow," said Taqiyuddin. "What about on the battlefield?" asked the shadow of God on earth. "Our troops shall gain a major victory, your majesty." Another wave of excitement rippled through the room. Eyes grew wide, glittering with delight. With that, the meeting was concluded. None of it came to pass, however. The war with Iran did not go as expected. Even though the Ottoman army was triumphant, the losses were too enormous to fool anyone. A drought followed. For months on end pantries remained empty. Children went to bed hungry. Worse was the earthquake that left entire neighborhoods in ruins. Afterwards the plague hit again. People died en masse, and were buried en masse. Wherever one turned there was poverty and grief. The comet had brought misery. but to none more than to Taqi-ud-Din. The ulama started to scheme about him. Having waited for an opportune moment to strike at the court astronomer, the new Shaykh al-Islam, Ahmet Shamseddin Effendi, attacked with all his might. It is because of the observatory that this calamity has fallen on the city. Who were they to watch God? It had to be the other way round, God should watch them. Human beings ought to have their eyes on the ground, not pointed towards the vault of heaven. The Sultan ordered the observatory to be demolished. The morning they heard the news, the apprentices ran to the master's house. Hardly able to speak, they looked past one another as though they were walking in a dream. Meanwhile Sinan spent the rest of the day sitting in the pavilion alone. Perhaps remembering another time when he and Taqi-ud-Din had been there. Hopeful and faithful. After the evening prayer he came out and said in a voice so soft and mellow it belied the hardness underneath, "You made it, you should raise it." But Master Nicola tried to protest. Jahan's self-control broke. Since Olef's death there had been much anger in his heart, and now it exploded. He said, "Is this why you let us build it? You didn't do it yourself because you knew this was bound to happen." The others gaped at him. It was the kind of thing they had all thought on the quiet, but they were astonished that he had had the discourtesy to say it out loud. Sinan said, "I wasn't aware. If I had known I'd not have asked you to do it." But once he began, Jahan couldn't stop. He insisted, "Then why don't you defend our observatory? How can you let this happen?" Sinan smiled sadly, the lines around his eyes deepening. "There are things that are in my hands and things that are not. I cannot prevent people from destroying. All I can do is keep building." The evening before the demolition, they retreated to their own corners, avoiding conversation. The master was upstairs in the Haremlik with his family, Nicola in the workshop, Dabud nowhere to be seen, Sancha in her room at the back of Sinan's house, and Jahan cloistered in the barn. The poor Kaya, unable to convince them to sup together, had to send everyone their food on separate trays. Jahan missed spending time alone with the elephant and attending to his every need, so tonight he chased away the young helper. In his heart of hearts, he believed that no one could look after the animal the way he did. Just as in the olden days, he washed the urine off the floor, shoveled the dung, topped up the water in the barrel, renewed the leaves in the trough. He scoured Chota's feet. The big, round front and the smaller, oval hind, careful not to hurt the doughy footpads underneath. He pored over his toenails, all 18 of them, which he then trimmed, cleaned, and rubbed with balm one by one. Drudging at construction sites and trudging up steep hills, year after year, had eventually taken its toll. 4 of his toenails had split and one was about to fall off. Jahan inspected the animal's trunk for warts, pleased to find none, and his tail for fleas and mites. He examined the soft tissue behind his ears for elephant lice. Which were the worst? It was odd to see a beast this huge utterly helpless in the face of the most infinitesimal creature. But the truth was one louse could ruin an elephant's temper. Though he found a few tiny brown lumps, thankfully there was nothing alarming. After washing him, Jahan checked his back for wounds and abscesses. Where his skin was dry he applied ointment. While he did this, Chota waited patiently, basking in the attention. Jahan, too, enjoyed the effort. It helped him to forget his despair, even though he knew it wouldn't be long before he remembered it again. When he was done, Chota swung his trunk as if to ask him how he looked. "There, handsome as gold," Jahan said. It was then that he heard footsteps behind the slightly open gate. "Down here," he yelled, expecting to see a houseboy with his meal. To his astonishment, it was Sinan. Wiping his hands on a greasy rag, Jahan scurried over to him. "Master, welcome." It didn't sound right to invite him into a barn, so he added hastily, "You want me to come out? Let's talk here." "Better." Jahan spread Choda's mantle on a mound of hay, making an odd chair, half velvet, half straw. "I never thought there'd come a day when I'd ask you what I'm about to ask." "Now," Sinan said after settling down. "What is it?" Jahan said, though he was not sure he wanted to hear the answer. "I need your skills. Not as a draftsman. Your earlier skills, if one may call them such." Seeing Jahan draw a blank, he explained, slowly, "Back when you used to help yourself to other people's belongings, I mean. I know you don't do it anymore." Shame. Horror. So the master knew all about his pilfering. A rush of guilt ran down to his fingertips. Still, he did not deny it. "Yes, right, but I don't understand. I need you to steal a few things for me, son." Jahan stared at him. "Tomorrow, as you know, the buildings shall be raised. The instruments. The books." It happened so fast Taqiyuddin did not have time to save much. "The doors are locked and no one can get in." Jahan nodded, finally beginning to see what he was suggesting. "If we could get at least a few books, it'd be some consolation to our friend." "It would indeed, master." "You don't have to accept, of course," Sinan said, dropping his voice to a whisper. "It could be a bad idea." "I think it's an excellent idea." "It could be dangerous, son." "Stealing always is, master, if you pardon my saying so." Sinan regarded his apprentice with a wistful smile, his head cocked to one side, as if the very sight of him both hurt and restored his spirit. "This has to remain a secret between us," Sinan said after a pause. "And Chota," Jahan said. "He can walk more quietly than a horse. And he can carry more things." "All right. We'll take him with us." "We? You mean you're coming with me?" "Certainly. I cannot send you on your own." Jahan thought about this for a moment. If he were caught, he would be taken for an ordinary thief. If Sinan were caught, he would lose his reputation, even his position in the court. His workers, his family, his students, each of whom looked up to him as a father figure, would be devastated. He said, "I cannot work with someone else beside me. It's against my nature." The master objected. The apprentice resisted. Sinan said he was calling the whole thing off. Jahan said it was too late, now that he had heard about it he would do it anyway. It was a bizarre war of words. They quarreled without quarreling. "Fine," said Sinan, conceding in the end with a perfunctory wave of his hand, which Jahan took as less a gesture of defeat than a sign of trust. Afterwards the master handed Jahan a pouch of coins. If he were to run into the night watchman, he should try to bribe him. It might work. It might fail. It depended on the man's disposition and what Providence had in store for Jahan. At the sound of an approaching footfall they both flinched. A boy appeared, carrying a tray with a bowl of steaming soup, bread, water, and baklava. They waited until he had served the food and left. "Eat," the master said. "It'll be a long night." Jahan tore a piece of bread, dumped it into the soup and swallowed it down, scalding his tongue, as a thought occurred to him. He said, "Is there anything in particular you want me to carry off?" "Well," Sinan replied, raising an eyebrow, expecting to be asked this. "Not the Instruments, they are too big. The books should be saved, as many as possible. If you can, find his Zij, you know how he exerted himself on it. The map of the moon, the sun, the stars, and the celestial bodies. Years and years of work. Why hadn't the chief royal astronomer taken it away with him? As if reading his mind, Sinan said, Taqi-ud-Din kept his valuable things in the observatory. That was his home. Jahan had a few spoonfuls of soup, then he popped another piece of bread into his mouth and put the rest into his sash. I'm ready to go. There was a full moon glowing over the city, a bonfire from a bygone age. Amid shadows, Jahan rode Chota towards Tofane. Against the leaden sky the buildings resembled two sorrowful giants hugging each other. A stab of pain went through Jahan as he realized that by this time tomorrow they would be gone. He jumped down and listened to the night to make sure there was no one around. Quietly, he told Chota to wait for him there, rewarding him with pears and nuts, which the beast instantly gobbled up. Jahan had brought large sacks to carry the books. After grabbing them and kissing Chota's trunk 3 times for good luck, he made straight for the observatory. First he tried the main entrance. There was a rusty padlock dangling from it. He fiddled a bit, making use of the blade and the spike he had brought with him in his sash. It would not be too hard to prise it open, he judged, yet he would be unable to put the thing back together in one piece. Tomorrow morning everyone would know someone had broken in. He crept behind the walls and checked the back doors on both sides. Since there was a passage between the buildings, it made no difference which door he went through so long as he found a way. Then he saw what he needed, a round window on the ground floor. He recalled that this winter it had come loose and never been fully repaired. Taqi-ud-Din had complained, saying the laborer had done a mediocre job. Then he had forgotten all about it. So had everyone else. The next moment Jahan was there, prodding. In a little while, the hinge gave way with a click. Pushing the window open, he slipped in. It was so dark inside. And he was so unprepared for this, that his knees buckled under him. He waited till his eyes had adjusted to the gloom, after which he began to identify things. He climbed up the spiral stairs and reached the library. A powerful smell of paper, vellum, ink, and leather hit him in the face. Each shelf was an open wound, bleeding into the night. Staggering, he glanced left and right. There were thousands of books, maps, and manuscripts. How was he to know which ones were more precious than others? How could he judge? By their age? By their author? By their theme? Jahan scampered from row to row, picking up the books at random, sniffed and touched them, then brought them near the window, where a wedge of moonlight shimmered. Words in Latin, Arabic, Ottoman, Hebrew, Greek, Armenian, Persian rained on him. He gasped. Suddenly, he was furious at himself. He was losing precious time with his doubts. Panicking, he took out the sacks he had brought and began to fill them with whichever books he could lay his hands on. Since he could not choose, he would not. He would save them all. In went the first shelf, then the second and the third. One sack was full already. The second sack swallowed the next 3 shelves. That was it. He took a step forward, doddering like a drunken man. It was too heavy. He had to remove some of the tomes, his hands trembling, his teeth chattering as though he had been left in a cold shaft of air. "I'll be back," he whispered. He went out, found Chota, unloaded the books up into his howdah and returned, running, panting. He cursed himself for not having thought of bringing a wheelbarrow. That would have been smarter. Again he filled the sacks, 5 more shelves, and again he dashed out. He could not count how many times he was able to make this return trip. He was puffing so hard he feared someone would hear him and it all would come to naught. Swallowing with a dry mouth, he tried to recover his composure. Outside the window the dawn was breaking. He told himself this had to be the final trip. This was it. Whatever he could save, he saved, whatever he could not, he let go. That was when something happened, something he would never reveal to anyone. Even years later as an old man, the books and manuscripts and maps and charts started to call his name, first in muted, then in increasingly shrill tones, begging him to take them with him. Jahan could see their mouths of ripped paper, their tears of ink. They threw themselves off the shelves, stepped on each other, blocked his way, their eyes wide with horror. Jahan felt like a man in a boat, searching for a dozen to save in a storm while hundreds were drowning around him. His eyes watered. He filled 3 more sacks and left quickly, as though being chased by an invisible force. How he mounted Chota, how he reached Sinan's home, he would not remember afterwards. He gave all the books to his master, and refused to get anywhere near them for fear they would talk to him again. Indian apprentice, you've saved so many, Sinan said. I abandoned many more, Jahan said dourly. A line of worry furrowing his forehead, Sinan emptied the sacks, wiped the books and hid them in his library. Later on he would inform Jahan that he had rescued 489 books. Only when Jahan returned to his room and put his head on his mattress and managed to calm his breathing did he realize that he had not, in his haste, remembered to look for Taqi-ud-Din's Zij. In the end the court astronomer had not been able to stave off what he most despised. Knowledge and wisdom had to be cumulative, an uninterrupted flow from one generation to the next, and yet the young astronomers who would come after him would have to start from the beginning all over again. The next day, shortly after dawn, the sky bleeding into the city, there they stood. The 6 of them, Sinan, the apprentices and the elephant, ready to destroy what they had erected. Not a pigeon ruffled its wings in the eaves, not a breeze stirred. Jahan noticed tears in Sanch's eyes. No one uttered a word. All day long, in charge of the teams of laborers who arrived with their sledgehammers and mallets and powder, they smashed up the doors and windows, caved in the walls. Chota pulled with all his might at the ropes tied to the wooden posts. People came to watch. Some of them cheered and clapped. Most stood in stunned silence. 5 days later, as the last stone was hauled away, there were prayers, just as there had been 3 summers ago when Sinan's apprentices had laid the foundation stone. Only this time the spectators were thanking God for knocking down an edifice of sin. Something inside Jahan shattered along with the observatory. If it weren't for his love of Miramah and his loyalty to Sinan, he would have abandoned this city of broken bricks and burned wood. Go away, whispered a voice within, but where? He was too old to undertake adventures new. Go, implored the voice. But how? Much as he took umbrage at her ways, Istanbul had seized hold of his soul. Even his dreams did not happen elsewhere. Go, warned the voice, but why? The world was a boiling cauldron, the same stew of hopes and sorrows. Near and far. For years on end he had devoted his life to a city where he had been, and still was, a stranger, his love to an unattainable woman, and his youth and strength to a craft that, though valued, was dismissed at the slightest change of events. What they raised in years, stone upon stone, could be destroyed in one afternoon. That which was treasured today was treated with contempt tomorrow. Everything remained subject to the whims of fate, and by now he had no doubt that fate was whimsical. The ensuing weeks were his most somber days in Istanbul. He could not help asking himself why they worked so hard at small details when no one, not the Sultan, not the people, and surely not God, minded how much effort they expended. They seemed to care for nothing but the size and the stateliness of the buildings and not offending the Almighty. Why did Sinan pay this much attention to the finest details when only a few noticed, and fewer appreciated them? Nothing ruins the human soul more than hidden resentment. Outwardly, Jahan kept doing the things he always did, toiling alongside his master and feeding Chota, even if he did not attend to his every need any longer. Inwardly, however, numbness seized his heart, wiping away signs of joy, like melting snow erasing the footprints of life. He was losing his faith in his workmanship. Little did he know, back then, that the worth of one's faith depended not on how solid and strong it was, but on how many times one would lose it and still be able to get it back. The coldest day in 40 years, they called it, the day Miramah died. Street cats in Scutari froze while jumping from one roof to the next, hanging in the air like crystal lamps. The mendicants, the pilgrims, the roaming dervishes and those of no fixed abode had to seek refuge in almshouses for fear of turning into ice. Why she chose such a day to leave this world, Jahan would never know. She was born in spring and loved flowers in bloom. She had been ill for months, her health declining despite the number of physicians around her increasing every day. Jahan had seen her 6 times during those dire months. On each occasion she was a bit thinner. More often he had seen Hesna Khatun, the reluctant courier. The old woman would come to the menagerie bringing messages from the princess and wait to one side while Jahan composed his answer. Jahan would take his time, choosing his words carefully, despite the nursemaid huffing and puffing beside him. Finally, with a glare she would take his sealed letter and vanish. Thus it was a letter Jahan was expecting that January morning in 1578 when the nursemaid appeared in the menagerie, wrapped in a fur cloak. Instead she said, "Your Highness would like to see you." Closed gates opened wide before him, hidden halls were illuminated. The guards who saw him coming turned their heads, pretending not to notice. Everything had been arranged. When Jahan reached her chamber he fought hard to keep his smile intact. Her face was inflamed, her body swollen. Her legs, her arms, her neck, even her fingers were bloated, as though she had been stung by the wasp she had been running from as a girl. "Jahan, beloved," she said. Jahan stopped feigning equanimity and buried his nose into the trimming of her bedspread. That was where he had been all this time, somewhere on the edge of her existence. Seeing him crying, she lifted her hand and said softly, "Don't." Immediately Jahan apologized. Again, she said, "Don't." The air in the chamber felt stale, because of the closed windows and the heavy curtains. Jahan had a sudden urge to open them, but he stayed put, motionless. She ordered him to come closer, despite the burning gaze of Hesna Khatun. She placed her hand upon his hand and, though they had touched before, always on the sly, this was the first time he felt her body open up to his. Jahan kissed her on the lips. He tasted the earth. "You and your white elephant have brought joy into my life," she said. Jahan tried to utter something to raise her spirits, but he could find no words that she would allow. A while later a servant brought her a bowl of custard. flavored with rosewater. The sweet scent that any other day would have whetted her appetite now made her retch. Jahan gave her water instead, which she drank thirstily. When I am not around you may hear things about me that you might not like. No one may dare to say such things about your highness. She gave a tired smile. Whatever happens after I am gone, I want you to think of me with warmth in your heart. Will you promise to take no notice of gossip-mongers and slanderers? I shall never believe them. She seemed relieved but instantly frowned as a new thought crossed her mind. What if you doubt me? Excellency, I'll never. She didn't let him continue. If you ever have suspicions about me, remember. Behind everything there is a reason. Jahan would have asked her what she meant had he not just then heard a shuffle of approaching feet. Her 3 children were brought in, walking in single file. Jahan was surprised to see how tall Aisha had become since the day he had last seen her. One by one they kissed their mother's hand. A deferential silence hung in the air, the youngest boy pretending to be composed, though the tremble of his lower lip betrayed him. Once they had left, Jahan gave Hesna Khatun a painful look. He could see from her constant fidgeting that the nursemaid wished him to leave. He didn't want to go. It was a small relief when Miramah, sensing his discomfort, said, "Stay." As darkness descended, her breathing turned shallow. Jahan and Hesna Khatun waited on each side of her, she praying, he remembering. Hours passed. In a haze. Well past midnight Jahan fought to keep his eyes open, seized by an irrational conviction that so long as he watched over her she would be fine. The call to prayer woke Jahan up. There was no movement in the room, not a sound. Seized by a cold panic, he staggered to his feet. He stared at the old woman, who looked like she had not slept a wink. Gone, Hesna Khatun said acidly. My gazelle has gone. 10 months later Sinan and the apprentices put the finishing touches on Sokolow's mosque. A central dome, 8 arches, 8 pairs, and a 2-story courtyard. An enclosed portico bathed with sunlight from copious windows. Adjoined the Nyan Square prayer hall. The minbar was of pure white marble, framed with turquoise tiles. Around the interior of the mosque ran a balcony. Dainty and elegant. Though not as majestic as a sultan's mosque, it had a strong character, like the man himself. The Grand Vizier Sokolu arrived to view the construction, escorted by advisors, sentinels, lackeys, and flatterers. He inspected the building that would make him immortal, asking endless questions, impatient for the laborers to finish. He carried himself with dignity, the most far-sighted man in the empire. Always astute. By now he had served under 3 sultans, Suleiman, Selim and Murad. How he had survived for so long, when many a statesman had lost his head for the slightest failing, was a question many asked. He was rumored to be assisted by a female jinn who was besotted with him and whose name no earthling could pronounce. Whenever Sokolu was in danger, this jinn warned him. Jahan watched the fuss from a distance. He had not forgotten that faraway day in Zajitvar, when they had placed into Chota's howdah the body of the deceased Sultan Suleiman, all the while pretending that he was alive. Since then, like a dedicated carver, time had chiseled Sokolo's features, giving his face a stern look. It was in that moment, as Jahan was thinking how much the man had aged, that the Grand Vizier stopped and turned back. His eyes gleamed when he saw the mahout. The elephant tamer, the Grand Vizier exclaimed with a contemptuous snap of his fingers. Why, you have white in your hair. You have aged. Jahan bowed respectfully and said nothing. Since Miramah had gone, he felt his years more heavily than ever. Sinan joined in. Jahan is one of my best apprentices, my lord. So Kalu asked Jahan how he was doing and where the elephant was, though he did not pay attention to the answer to either question. In an hour the Grand Vizier galloped away. Jahan did not take his eyes off him until he became no more distinct than the shadows along the road and was, eventually, swallowed by the dusk. That same night a storm blew down the staves, bent over the trees and flooded the pits, leaving everything in disarray. Next morning Jahan found the site covered in mire. Dirty rivulets ran on all sides. Ahead of him a dozen laborers were pushing to dislodge a cart stuck in sludge. Another team was erecting a massive timber with the help of steel pulleys, shouting in unison Allah, Allah, as though the construction was a holy war to be won. On the sloped roof there were workmen mending the damaged parts. Wherever he looked he saw people working away to fix things. The only one not working was Chota, wallowing in a brown pool, delighted. There was a makeshift shed outside the mosque, opposite the narthex, where the master retreated whenever he needed to rest. On that day, suffering from back pain, he spent the afternoon there, lying on a flat surface, wrapped in warm towels. A Jewish physician arrived and drew 2 bowls of blood from him to release the malignant humors. He then applied poultices to his aching joints. After the evening prayer the door was opened and the master walked out, pale and drowsy but otherwise fine. He waved at Jahan, and was about to mouth a salute when something strange happened. One of the workmen on the roof who was pulling up the lead sheets lost control of his load. The rope he was holding snapped, sending the entire load plummeting just as Sinan was passing by. A cry pierced the air. Loud, sharp, and distinctively female. It was Sancha. 3 words spilled from her lips: Master, watch out. The lead sheets came down with a horrible crash. Sinan, having miraculously veered aside, was spared. Had he not moved, they would have sliced him in two. Like the sword of Damocles. I'm fine, Sinan said when they ran to him. That was when, one by one, all heads turned to Sancha. She blushed up to her ears under their prying stares, her lips sagging. Into an awkward silence Sinan said, how blessed we are to hear Yusuf's voice. Fear loosens tied tongues, they say. Sancha, trembling, lowered her head, her body that of a rag doll. During the remaining hours of work she avoided everyone. Jahan dared not go near her. The workers were suspicious. There is a Hansa among us, they whispered with sidelong glances. Someone who was half woman, half man, forever stuck in limbo. The possibility that Yusuf was a woman had not occurred to anyone. The next day Sinan's chief apprentice was absent from the site. And the day after that, it was explained that, feeling unwell, Yusuf had to go away for a few weeks. Where or how, no one inquired. Somehow all and sundry, having stumbled upon a secret, had sensed that it was better, safer, to know nothing. Only Jahan understood that this was the end. Sancha would not be working with them again. She would be putting herself and the master in peril if she were to return. She had gone back to the life she abhorred, the life of a concubine. The same week Jahan was wending his way through the site, lost in thought, when he glimpsed a rope that Chota had trampled in the mud. Unthinking, he picked it up. As he inspected it, his face sank. The 2 strings on the sides had snapped, leaving the fiber splintered, while the strings in the middle were shorter and straight, as if slashed by a blade. Someone had thinned the rope by cutting its core. Outside it looked like an ordinary rope, inside it was weak as an eggshell. Straight away Jahan went to see his master. Someone laid a trap. Wordlessly, Sinan squinted at the rope. Are you saying this was no accident? I don't believe so, Jahan said. Why did you come out of the shed, master? I heard someone call for me, said Sinan. Must be the same person who planned this. He knew the rope would break. Because he cut it? Poor San. Yusuf tried to save you. And now he is doomed. Since you know so much already, Sinan said, his eyes infinitely sad, you should know she is at home with my family. Master, working with you is her only joy. You ought to bring her back. Sinan shook his head. I cannot have her here anymore. It isn't safe. Jahan pursed his lips, trying to bite back words that he might regret. Afterwards. Are we not going to investigate who did this? What can be done? I cannot interrogate every man on the site. If the workers suspect I don't trust them, they'll lose their will to work. Uneasiness came over Jahan. He, on the contrary, believed that Sinan should question everyone until the culprit was found. He said, in a voice he didn't know. He was capable of, Michelangelo mourned his assistant like his son. Whereas you don't even care for us. Glass, wood, marble, metal. Are we not like these in your eyes, mere instruments in your constructions? Into the ensuing silence Sinan said, slowly, that's not true. But Jahan was no longer listening. Even with one apprentice missing, the master finished Sokalu's mosque on time. Prayers were chanted, hennet sheep and rams were sacrificed. Sokalu, glowing with pride and joy, gave bakshish to the laborers and freed 100 of his slaves. Shortly afterwards, at a meeting of the divan, a man dressed up as a dervish asked to see the Grand Vizier. Like Sokalu, he, too, came from Bosnia. For a reason nobody could fathom, then or afterwards, Sokalu gave him permission to come in, to come close. He was stabbed by the stranger, who was caught and killed before anyone could discover the reason behind the bloodshed. Sokalu, Sokolovic, the Grand Vizier and one of the last patrons of architecture, was gone. The female jinn, if there was one, had failed to warn him this time. After Sokalu's assassination, the Sultan would appoint a succession of viziers. One after the other, none coming close to their predecessor. All at once, it was as though a lid had been lifted and the boiling cauldron underneath exposed. The imperial treasury was empty, the coins not worth their value. The Janissaries were furious, the peasants upset, the ulama dissatisfied, Master Sinan too old and too frail, and his mute apprentice no longer by his side. In his dream Jahan was in his village. He trudged through the path leading to their house, the sun hot on his neck. Finding the gate open, he strode in. There was no one in the courtyard. Then he noticed a faint movement under a tree, a tiger. Not far from it a peacock strutted, a deer grazed on a scrubby tuft of grass. He plodded with the utmost slowness so as not to draw attention to himself. A vain attempt, since the cat had already noticed him. Its eyes flicked to his. Uninterested. At each step he came across other animals, a rhino, a bear, a giraffe. In his absence his family had built a menagerie. Their house had been enlarged with more rooms, additional floors. Desperately, he searched for his mother and sisters, trotting along the marble corridors. Upstairs, in a room that resembled the Sultan's palace, he stumbled upon his stepfather, sitting by himself. The man pointed towards the back garden. Only there was no back garden anymore. In its stead ran a rowdy river. Far ahead in a boat being dragged by the current was Sinan. Jahan shouted. At his voice Sinan stood up and lost his balance, fluttering his arms like a bird about to take flight. The boat capsized, sending him into the water. Someone was shouting next to Jahan's ear, poking him on the shoulder. Wake up, Indian. Jahan did, his heart beating fast. Staring at him was the last person he expected to see, Mirka the bear tamer. Jahan scowled at him, the memory of that night years ago returning as fast as a sword pulled out of its sheath. Mirka took a step back, his hands raised in a gesture of defense. Something happened. We had to tell you. Only then did Jahan notice the boy standing beside him. It was Abe, Chota's new tamer, a young, slender, black African, no older than 16. A kind soul. But so inexperienced Jahan wouldn't trust him with a rabbit, let alone an elephant. What happened? Asked Jahan. Mirka averted his gaze. The beast's gone. He ran away. Kicking off the blanket, Jahan leaped to his feet and seized Abe by the arm. Where were you? Why didn't you keep an eye on him? The boy went limp, an empty sack in his hands. Mirka pulled Jahan away from him. It's not his fault. The beast went on a rampage, snapped his chains. Never seen him this mad. Something must have irritated him, Jahan said. What did you do to him? Nothing, Abe answered, his voice dripping with fear. He was possessed. Jahan changed into his shalwar and splashed water on his face. They tiptoed past the dormitories. Upon reaching the menagerie, they stopped at the entrance of the empty barn, looking for clues that weren't there. Which way did he go? Jahan asked. A glance passed between Mirka and Abe. He went out the main gate. The guards could not stop him. Jahan's heart sank. In a city so vast, how could he find Chota before he got himself into trouble? I need a horse and a letter of permission, Jahan said to Mirka. We'll ask the chief white eunuch. He'll be furious when he hears. But we've got to find the beast. In a little while Jahan was outside the palace gates, riding with no idea about which way to go. The streets sprawled in front of him, opening like fans. His horse, an aged, pale brown steed, was reluctant to gallop, though it soon gained pace. They passed through squares and bazaars. Rounding a corner, Jahan came across a watchman with 2 janissaries on his heels. The watchman lifted a cudgel, yelling, You, stop. Jahan did. Are you a jinn? No, Effendi, I'm a human like you, Jahan said. Then get off your horse. What are you doing outside at this hour, defying the Sultan's rules? Come with us. Effendi, I'm from the palace, Jahan said, as he held onto the pommel of the saddle with one hand and gave him the letter of permission with the other. An animal escaped. I have been sent to fetch it. Reading the letter, the man mumbled, What sort of an animal? An elephant, Jahan said. When there followed no response, he added, The biggest creature on land. How are you going to catch it? I'm his tamer, Jahan said, his voice breaking. He'll do as I say. Jahan wasn't sure about this, but luckily they did not press him further. He felt their eyes on his back even after he had left the street. It was only when he saw a muezzin on his way to a mosque for the morning prayer that he realized how long he had been out searching. He remembered the ancient graveyard overlooking the Golden Horn and the talk that had passed between him and Sangram a lifetime ago. I heard a strange thing about these beasts. They say they choose where they'd like to die. This one seems like he has found his place. When Jahan reached the site he was looking for, a wisp of cloud was hiding the moon, and a tang of salt was in the wind. He caught sight of a large shadow ahead, perhaps a boulder. Jumping off his horse, he approached. Chota. The boulder shifted. Why did you come here? Chota lifted his head and let it drop immediately. His mouth, most of his teeth gone, opened and closed. Naughty boy. Don't do this again. Jahan hugged his trunk, weeping. Together they witnessed the break of day. The sky showed them its brightest hues, like a cloth merchant hawking his precious silks. Jahan watched Istanbul. With its seagulls, steep slopes and cypress trees, seized by a dawning comprehension that their time in the city was coming to an end. Strangely, it didn't make him feel sad. That would come later, he knew. Sadness was always belated. After much begging, Jahan managed to convince Chota to follow him to the palace. They put him in his barn, chained him with stronger fetters, filled his buckets with new fodder and hoped his escape would soon be forgotten. Yet the Mahout finally had to face what he had refused to see before. The elephant was dying. And the great beast wanted to be alone when the end arrived. After the master, there was a tree in paradise unlike any on earth. Its branches were translucent. Its roots absorbed milk instead of water, and its trunk glittered as if icebound. Though when one got close to it, it was not cold at all. Every leaf of this tree was marked with the name of a human being. Once a year, during the month of Shaban, on the night between the 14th and the 15th day, all the angels gathered around it, forming a circle. In unison, they flapped their wings. Thus they raised a powerful wind that shook the branches. Gradually, some of the leaves fell off. Sometimes it took a leaf quite a while to drop down. At other times, the descent was as quick as the blink of an eye. The moment a leaf reached the ground, the person whose name was written on it breathed his last. This was why the wise and the learned would never step on a dry leaf, lest it bore the soul of someone somewhere. In 1588, a rainy day it was, Master Sinan's leaf touched the soil. He had worked until the final moments, his health and his mind always strong. It was only in the last weeks that he was bedridden. The three apprentices clustered around him, together with the head foreman who had worked with Sinan for so long. The women, clad in their veils, lined up by the door, and even though Jahan dared not glance in their direction, he knew one of them was Sancha, Sinan's loving concubine. His voice merely a whisper, the chief royal architect told them, in the faint light that seeped through the blinds, that he had written, signed, and sealed his will. He said, "You shall read it when I am gone. You are not going anywhere, master. May God always keep you with us." Nicola said, furtively wiping a tear. The master lifted his hand, as if to wave away such pleasantries. "There is something important you should know. The accidents, the delays. I have found out how they happened. It was in front of my eyes, all this time, I never saw." Suddenly the air in the room changed. Everyone held his breath, waiting to hear more. A tense anticipation gushed into the space where there had only been sorrow a while ago. "Wait for 40 days after my death," Sinan said, stumbling over his words. "Open my will and see which one of you I'd like to become my successor, God willing. You ought to carry on building. You ought to surpass what I've done." "Master, about the accidents, you were saying. Aren't you going to tell us who's behind them?" Jahan asked. "Jahan, fiery spirit, you were always the most curious one," Sinan said. With difficulty. It all must have happened for a reason. One must think of the reason, not hate the person. Remembering Miramah's final words, Jahan felt an ache so powerful he couldn't talk. She, too, had mentioned that everything had a reason. He waited for an explanation, but it didn't come. In a little while the apprentices were ushered out, as they had tired the master enough. It was the last time Jahan saw him. The next night, earlier than usual, Sinan went to sleep. He did not wake up. And this is how, after almost 50 years as the chief royal architect and 400 exquisite buildings, not counting his many shrines and fountains, Sinan departed this world. He had always left a flaw in his works to acknowledge he wasn't perfect or complete, as such qualities belonged solely to God. In much the same way he died, at the glorious but imperfect age of 99 and a half. On the 7th day following Sinan's death his family summoned a prayer meeting for his soul. Relatives, neighbors, pashas, artisans, students, laborers, and passers-by, came from far and wide to attend the rite. There were so many guests that they spilled into the courtyard and from there onto the street, all the way down to the next neighborhood. Even those who had never met him mourned his loss as if he were one of their own. Hard-boiled candies and sherbets were offered, meat and rice distributed to the rich and the poor. Olive branches were burned while the Quran was recited from beginning to end. Yusuf Sinanatan bin Abdullah. His name was uttered in unison, over and again, an incantation that opened closed hearts. Halfway through, Jahan caught the whiff of a fragrance he knew well, the blend of ambergris and jasmine with which his master perfumed his kaftans. He glanced around, wondering if he were here, watching them from an alcove or a niche, listening to what was said in his absence, smiling that smile of his. Jahan reflected on Sancha, knowing she was somewhere in the house, behind these walls, her forehead pressed against the glazed window, her short hair adorned with a gauzy scarf. It pained him so much, the knowledge that she could no longer work with them, that he had to chase away his thoughts, like a flock of black crows. After the prayer, the apprentices walked together for a while, Nicola, David, and Jahan. The sky was murky and overcast, as though to reflect their mood. Dry leaves hovered in the breeze, seagulls plunged for a morsel. They kept running out of conversation. It wasn't only grief. There was something else, something that hadn't been there before. Jahan understood that throughout all these years, Sinan had been the invisible thread holding them together. True, in the past, they had displayed petty jealousies, but Jahan had always attributed these to a shared love of the master and a wish to excel in his eyes. Now he saw that, in truth, they had been more different than alike, the three of them, three passing winds, each headed in a different direction. He wasn't the only one who sensed this. All at once, they were weighing their words like polite strangers. As they made their way across a bazaar, they stopped to get some flat bread. With pekmey*, none of them had eaten at the house of mourning and the walk had made them hungry. Jahan was haggling with a vendor when, right behind him, he heard a sneeze. Glancing sideways, it was not from a stranger, as he had expected. Instead, it was from Nicola, now half covering his face, as though in shame. When he pulled his hand away, there was a drop of blood on his palm. "You all right?" Jahan asked. Silently, Nicola nodded. His eyes were two shooting stars in the serene firmament of his face. David, engrossed in the turtles that a peasant was selling, seemed not to have noticed anything. Turtles were sought after these days, as their shells, when crushed into a powder and eaten with yogurt soup, were said to cure many an illness. Under the swooping boughs of a willow tree they tucked into their food. Gossiped about the people who had attended the ceremony and those who had not shown up. But there was one question nobody dared to broach: who among them would replace their master? They would have to wait for the will to be opened. Until then, it was futile to speculate. How could they know what was cast in the runes, written in the stars, when even Taqi-Uddin had not? So they spoke about this and that, curt words that did not add up to anything, and soon afterwards each went his own way. The next day, Jahan was summoned to the chief white eunuch's quarters and informed that he was to start teaching at the palace school, a reputable job that filled him with apprehension and pride in equal measure. Later on, when he met his students, he found in their young faces innocence and curiosity, pretension and ignorance, dexterity and laziness. Which of these qualities would take precedence over the rest, he wondered? Would schooling make any difference, or had their paths already been drawn? Had his master been alive, he would say, every man is given his own kismet, for God never repeats the same fate twice. Immersed in his own concerns, weeks passed by. It was only then that it occurred to him he had not heard from either Davud or Nicola. He sent both a message. When no answer came from either, he was worried, particularly for Nicola. Davud had a wife and children. Sancha still lived in Master Sinan's house. Jahan had Chota and a bed in the menagerie and now another one in the palace school. But Nicola had only his aged parents, both of whom had recently passed away. He realized how little he knew him. All these years they had toiled side by side, summer and winter, and yet they still remained a mystery to each other. On Tuesday morning, Jahan decided to visit Nicola. Fog had settled into the city. The sun was a blurry halo behind billows of grey. At first glance, the settlement of Galata on the far side of the Golden Horn was the same as always. Houses, half stone, half wood, were arranged in rows like decayed teeth. There were churches with no bells, the scents of candles and incense wafted from the chapels, and a medley of people: Florentines, Venetians, Greeks, Armenians, Jews and Franciscan monks, milled about. Jahan rode his horse at a trot, observing his surroundings. As he went deep into the back alleys, the crowd thinned. It became quiet. Too quiet. Something was not right. Closed shutters, bolted doors, packs of ravenous dogs, dead cats on the pavement, and a foul smell that enveloped everything. Upon entering Nicholas Street, he shuddered, as though a nippy breeze had passed through him. There were crosses painted on some of the houses, and prayers in Latin and Greek, unfinished and unintelligible, scribbled in haste. Jumping off his horse, he went near another sign, only this one was on Nicola's door. He didn't know how long he stood there staring, unable to leave, unwilling to go inside. A neighbor, a man with a back so hunched that he seemed bent, approached. "What do you want?" "My friend lives here." "Kairais Nicola, you know him." "I know everyone." "Don't go in there. Stay away." "What is it?" "The curse, it's back." "You mean?" Jahan halted, detecting the man's contempt for his ignorance. "It was the plague again." "How have we not heard about it?" "Dolt. You only hear what you are allowed to hear," the man said before he strode away. He didn't go too far. From the threshold of the house across the street he kept watch, his eyes like narrow slits. Jahan took his sash off and wrapped it around his mouth and nose. He pushed Nicola's door. Had it been locked, he would have given up. But it was ajar, propped open with a wedge to make sure it wouldn't close. Whoever had placed this here intended to return and knew there was no one inside to open the door. Upon entering the house, a heavy stench hit him like an unexpected blow. He found himself in a corridor, narrow, musty and dim. He had to wait for his eyes to adjust to the gloom. The first room was empty. In the next one, by the pale light of a candle, a man was lying on a mat. His dark hair lacked luster, his skin was drained of color, his high domed forehead was covered in sweat. It was not Nicola, this man with a few days' stubble on his always carefully shaved face. Beside him was a small wooden figure of a man with a chestnut beard and long hair. There were 2 clay bowls by his side, one with water, one with vinegar. His clothes were damp with sweat, his lips chapped. Jahan put his hand on his forehead. It was burning. At Jahan's touch he flinched. With a great effort he turned his head towards him, unseeing. "It's me, Jahan." Nicola's breath came out in sputters, like the crackle of a smoldering log before it burns out. "Water," Nicola rasped. He drank greedily. Through his open shirt Jahan saw spots on his chest, a purple that verged on black, and a nasty swelling in his armpit. He had a pressing urge to run away from this place of suffering, but, while his mind whispered cowardice, his body stayed anchored. Soon there was a rattle at the door. 2 nuns appeared. Long dark cloaks, white muslin masks on their mouths. "Who are you?" the elder one demanded. "What do you want?" "I'm his friend," Jahan said. "We worked together under the late Chief Royal Architect." A startled silence hung in the space between them. "I'm sorry if I spoke harshly," she said. "I took you for a thief." Jahan felt a rush of dismay, dreading that this woman with eyes old and calm as stones had seen through him. Unaware of his thoughts, the nun went on. "Nobody comes to these houses. Only robbers." "Robbers?" "Yes, they come to steal from." She did not finish her sentence. Instead she moved towards Nicola. She made him drink out of the flask she had brought and wiped his forehead with a flannel dipped in vinegar, touching him without any sign of the repugnance that Jahan had felt. Meanwhile the other nun was busy wiping excrement off the sheets. Jahan wanted to ask them if they were not afraid of death, but he kept his thoughts to himself. He whispered, "Are there many others?" "No, but there will be." Nicola started to cough. Blood spilled from his mouth and nose. The elder nun, seeing Jahan's horror, said, "You should go. There is nothing you can do here." Saddened but somehow relieved to hear this, Jahan asked, "How can I help?" "Pray," was all she said. Jahan inched towards the door, then stopped. "That figure over there, who is he?" "Saint Thomas," said the nun with a tired smile. "The patron saint of carpenters, builders, architects, and construction workers. He was also known as a doubter. He doubted everything, could not help it. But God loved him just the same." 2 days later Jahan heard that Nicola had died. In a world where everything was in flux, he, the most stable and reliable soul he had known after Master Sinan, was gone. Then followed the others. Hundreds of them. From Galata the disease traveled to Üsküdar, leaped to Istanbul and, as if thrust by an angry hand, bounced back to Galata. Once again, mobs took to the streets, looking for someone to blame. Nor was the palace immune. The Chinese twins who took Care of the apes went the way of all flesh. The monkeys turned aggressive. Unhappy in the royal cages where their forefathers had once been such privileged guests. Taras the Siberian hid in his shed, ashamed to be alive at his age. Then Sangram died. This kind-hearted, loyal servant of the Seraglio, who had always wished to return to Hindustan someday, breathed his last miles away from his homeland. The next victim was Simeon the bookseller of Pera. His wife, duped by some tinkers and vendors, agreed to sell his books for a handful of aspers. Piled on rickety carts, those precious books from all the world over left Pera and traveled to their new destinations. Many got lost on the way. Simeon, who had always desired to be in charge of a magnificent library, had not even been able to bequeath his own collections to someone who would appreciate them. Jahan, who learned about all this much later, waited in suspense, wondering who would be the next. But for a reason he could not comprehend, the disease spared him and continued on its pilgrimage south like a predatory bird, casting a dark shadow over the villages and towns it passed through. In the Christian cemetery, not far from the Virgin of the Spring, where Emperor Justinian's church was no more but the Holy Spring remained, Nicola's headstone read, "Architect Nicola ascended to the skies like the towers he built. May his soul rest in the vault of heaven. And Saint Thomas be his companion." Upon returning to the palace, Jahan found Chota alone. When he saw his old tamer, the animal trumpeted and stomped his feet. Jahan patted his trunk, offered him the pears and nuts he had brought along. In the past Chota would have smelled them long before Jahan arrived. But lately he had lost his ability to smell, along with his strength. Perching on a barrel, Jahan told him about Nicola's funeral. The animal listened to his every word, squinting in his usual way. When Jahan wept, Chota's trunk slid around his chest, hugging him. Once again, Jahan had the impression that the white elephant understood everything he said. In a little while they heard footsteps. Two shadows appeared at the door. Sangram's lad, who had taken over, so resembled his father in looks and demeanor that they all called him Sangram, as though the same soul had been resurrected and death was merely a game. Abe, Chota's keeper, was with him. "Jahan is here," said Sangram the son, happy to see the man he had known and loved as an uncle. "I'm here, but where was he?" Jahan rasped, pointing at Abe. "Why do you leave the elephant unattended? He's got a broken toenail. Do you have any idea how that must hurt? It needs to be trimmed and washed. It's a mess around this place. When was the last time you cleaned?" Mumbling his regrets, Abe grabbed a brush and started to sweep every which way. In the sun rays falling through the wooden cracks, dust was swirling. Sangram the son approached with a troubled stare. "You heard the news?" "What news?" "Davad. He has been raised." "What did you say?" "Everyone's talking about it. Your friend is the new chief royal architect." "Our Davad?" Jahan stammered. "Well, not ours anymore. He is way up there," said Sangram the son, pointing at the ceiling, where a spider had woven a cobweb and a horsefly, long dead, dangled. "You mean they opened the will?" Sangram the son looked at Jahan with unmistakable pity. "They did. Your master wished him to be his successor, it appears." "Well, that's good," stuttered Jahan, feeling dizzy, as though a precipice had opened up under his feet and he was falling fast. A few days later Sinan's wife Kara, according to the custom, freed several of the household slaves. The first one to be granted Bharat * was Sancha. Jahan had always suspected that Kara had mixed feelings about this unusual concubine under her roof, a woman who had shared things with her husband. That she never could. If she had been averse to Sanchez dressing up as a man and working on construction sites, she must have kept her feelings to herself. Even so, Jahan had little doubt that Kara was aware of Sanchez's love for the master and didn't like it at all. Between them the two women had dug a silent abyss that no one, not even Sinan, could bridge. And now that he was gone, Sanchez was the last face Kara wished to see. Still, she did not ill-treat her slave. Buying satins, taffetas, and perfumes, she gave Sancha her blessing before she let her go. This is how, after decades as a captive in Istanbul, Sancha de Herrera, the daughter of a renowned Spanish physician, was freed. She sent Jahan a letter. Her words burst with excitement and apprehension. Timidly, she asked if he would help her with the arrangements for leaving. Because she did not know the first thing about what to do, where to begin. She said she would have loved to get David's help as well, but that he was unaware of the truth. At times, she wasn't even sure who she was any longer, Yusuf the builder or Nurjais the concubine. Jahan answered without delay. Esteemed Sancha, your letter has brought me happiness and despair. Happiness because finally you are free to go. Despair because you are leaving. I shall come and help you next Thursday. Do not worry about being ready. You have been ready for this for a long, long time. On the chosen day, Jahan visited her in Sinan's house. For the first time since they had met, he saw her wearing a dress, an emerald green gown with a cone-shaped skirt that brought out the color of her eyes. On her still short hair was a matching headdress of the sort ladies wore in the land of Frangistan. Don't stare at me like that, she said, blushing under his gaze. I feel ugly. How can you say that, protested Jahan. It's the truth. I'm too old for pretty clothes. Watching her cheeks turn a darker shade of pink, Jahan said quickly. Teasingly, imagine, if all these years the Masons had known there was a beauty among them, they'd have stopped work to write you poems. We couldn't have built a thing. She chuckled and cast her eyes down, her fingers ran along the pleats of her gown, under which was a farthingale of whalebone. It's so tight I can hardly breathe. How do women manage this? You'll get used to it in no time. Nay, it's going to take me years. I'll be dead by then, she said, smiling, a smile that instantly disappeared. I wish he had seen me like this. Above them the sky was blue and bright, as still as a looking glass. Outside, a cart rattled by. Peeping out of the window, Jahan saw it was loaded with cages of falcons, their eyes hooded. Distracted by the birds, he had not realized that Sancha, beside him, was weeping. A lad who was a girl, a mute with the gift of speech, a concubine yet an architect, she had lived a life of lies and layers, no less than Jahan. What is upsetting you? Jahan asked. I thought you'd be overjoyed now that you're free. I'm glad, she said, unconvincingly. Only his grave is here. Everything we did together. He has more marks on this city than any sultan. Master's gone, Jahan said. You are not leaving him. She tried, for a brief moment, not to talk about him, struggling with herself. Losing. Do you think he loved me? Jahan hesitated. I believe he did. Otherwise why would he have allowed you to join us? He'd have been in trouble if anyone found out. He put himself in danger for me, Sanchez said with a speck of pride. But he never loved me. Not the way I loved him. This time Jahan did not respond. Nor did Sancha seem to be waiting for an answer. She said, I heard there is a Venetian ship setting sail in 2 weeks' time. Jahan nodded. Several times in the past days, he had observed its topmast looming over the roofs and trees. I'll make arrangements. I'd be grateful, Sancha said. Trepidation flickered in her eyes. Come with me. There is nothing that binds you here. Jahan was surprised to hear her speak like this. All the same, he decided to take it lightly. We'd build mansions for Spanish grandees. She held his hand, her touch soft and cold. We might find a patron. I have made inquiries. We could take care of each other. Watching her familiar gestures, Jahan felt a stir in his heart. He saw what she saw. United by the memory of the master, their hearts numb to all but their craft. They could work together. Love was not needed. Better without it? Love only brought pain. If I'd been younger, we could have had children, she said slowly, as though weighing each word. Despite himself, Jahan beamed. Girls with your eyes and your bravery. Boys with your curiosity and kindness. What about Chota? Jahan murmured. Chota is old. He has been happy in the palace. He'll be fine. But you and I need to go on building. Wisdom does not rain from the sky, it springs from the earth, from hard work. Said Jahan, remembering the words of their master. The dome, Sancho went on. We should raise domes that remind people there is a God and that he is not a God of revenge and hell but of mercy and love. Jahan rested his head in his hands and closed his eyes. I'm frightened, she said. It's been such a long time since I was torn from my father's land that I'm a stranger to their ways now. You'll be fine, Jahan said, trying to reassure her. I will, if you come with me. What do you say? In that moment Jahan understood that life was the sum of the choices one did not make, the paths yearned for but not taken. He had never felt as much compassion for Sancha as he did now, the moment when he understood that he would refuse her. She saw it in his face, his resistance. A flash of hurt flickered in her eyes, but she did not cry. Her tears she kept for the master, her one and only love. Pray remember me, Jahan said. Only the slightest break in her voice betrayed her disappointment when she said, I shan't ever forget. About a week later, the Venetian ship, a 3-mast carrack with a rounded stern, was ready to return home. The Venetian traders had been losing their privileges to French, Dutch, and English merchants. The captain wore his unhappiness like the jacket that wrapped him tight. Even so, there was enough of a bustle to distract him from his worries. The toing and froing of sailors loading the barrels and sellers hawking their merchandise. A small gathering of passengers waited off to one side, Jesuit priests, Catholic nuns, travelers, a British well-born fanned by his servants. Other than these the rest were rough seamen. Shielding his eyes from the sun, Jahan looked around, unable to see Sancha anywhere. It occurred to him that she might have changed her mind. Perhaps. When she woke she realized that the land of her childhood was far and elusive, a dream impossible to reclaim. But then, as he zigzagged his way through the barrels waiting to be loaded, he saw her before him, her shadow extending away from her, as though it and only it had decided to stay. To his surprise, she had gone back to her apprenticeship clothes and stood beside him as a man. I like it better like this. Jahan looked over her shoulder for porters. There were none. Where are your things? She pointed at a rucksack on the ground. Your robes? Kara's gifts. Don't tell her. I gave them to the poor. She opened her bag, showed him the carved box Sinan had made for her. Next to it were a dozen scrolls and a necklace of some worth. I'm taking these. Master bequeathed them to me. They walked silently until they reached the ramp that connected the ship to the land. I did not get a chance to wish Davud farewell, she said. Give him my regards and good wishes. I can't believe he is the chief royal architect now. I shall tell him, Jahan said pensively. The truth was he had not been able to congratulate Davud himself. He hadn't felt like it. He inhaled a lungful of air. Make sure nobody finds out you're a woman. If you sense any, I can take care of myself. She held herself ramrod straight. I know you can. She lifted her eyes to his. I had a nasty dream last night. You were trapped. You called for me but I couldn't find you. Be careful, will you? Someone shouted an order from the stern of the ship. Jahan felt his throat closing. Everything was changing, flowing, like sand between his fingers. Miramah had crossed the Great Divide and he couldn't wait to join her when his time came. The master and Nicola were gone, he and Davud rarely saw each other. Chota was not long for this world, and now Sancho was leaving. He had been wrong to pity Nicola for being alone. He was just as lonely. For a moment, the desire to accompany Sancha, the one person who cared for him, was almost too strong to endure. He would have gone had it not been for the elephant. That afternoon, under shrieking seagulls and a wash of sunlight as gauzy as muslin, he watched the prow of the ship slice with ease through the water, at every heartbeat taking the mute apprentice, and her story, further and further away. Unable to put his thoughts on paper, Jahan found a scribe to help him write to Davud. After listening, the man set off and scribbled without a pause, save to dip the pen into the ink. When he was done, Jahan was holding a letter dripping with salutations and felicitations. It cost 6 aspers. Jahan wasn't expecting an immediate answer, not from a man who had risen so high. Yet Davud wrote back. The scroll was sealed in red, the handwriting, by a scribe of an upper rank, elegant. Everything had happened swiftly, he explained. Our gracious Sultan, may he live 100 years, upon opening the will of Master Sinan and learning about his last wish, bestowed a distinguished honor on me, his humble subject. He threw the precious robe of our master on my insignificant shoulders. How could he have rejected it? Davud asked, as though he needed affirmation. He told Jahan to come to see him. They would share memories and talk about forthcoming works, just like in the old days. Much as Jahan wanted to pay him a visit, he could not. His heart was not pure. It worried him that Davud would see it in his eyes, the jealousy oozing out of his pores. Until recently they had been equals. Now his friend was a man favored by fate. Jahan understood that between people with a similar standing the hardest thing to accept was when one moved up and the other did not. In those rare moments when he managed not to feel envy, he was ridden with guilt. Instead of being happy for Davud and praying for his success, he begrudged him his good fortune. If Sinan were alive, Jahan thought, he would have been ashamed of him. So he waited. Days passed by. Whether he wanted to or not, he heard constantly about Davud, how, in a ceremony in his honor, he had been given a golden chisel, pouches of coins and Master Sinan's seal, a carved jade ring. Snippets of information rained down from everywhere, how he was seen in a kaftan so precious that no one could wear it unless allowed by the Sultan, how he was fond of Circassian concubines and filled his harem with them, how he had married second and third wives, each as winsome as a fairy, how he had peacocks strutting in his courtyard and a falcon brought from Samarkand. Half of these tales Jahan suspected were false. The remaining half were enough to fill his heart with bitterness. Jahan kept teaching at the palace school, finding consolation in the innocence of his students. At night, alone in his bed, he designed buildings that would never be built. One of these was a garden where wild animals roamed free and people walked through a maze of tunnels with large panes of glass that enabled them to watch the beasts without putting themselves in danger. Chota lost 3 more toenails. A mysterious disease, Jahan suspected, and stopped accusing Abe of neglect. The elephant had got old. So had Jahan, though he was unwilling to accept this. A month later he received a message informing him that a building was to be raised on the 4th hill, a new mosque, and he had been appointed as head foreman. He would be paid a generous sum. It showed how much Davud trusted him. While he was burning with envy, his friend had decided to honor him. Jahan could not avoid seeing him any longer. Composing a letter, writing it himself this time, he thanked him for the privilege and asked permission to visit. Davud sent a reply, inviting him to his new house in Ayup, by the Golden Horn. It wasn't a hard place to find, the locals raved about it. A mansion with a sweet-smelling garden that extended as far as the eye could see. There was no need to knock on the door, he was expected. A manservant welcomed Jahan at the iron gates, ushered him across a pathway into the house and then into a wide, bright room facing south. Left on his own, Jahan glanced around. There wasn't much furniture, yet what little there was exquisite. A cabinet inlaid with mother-of-pearl and matching low tables, a sofa topped with embroidered cushions, gilded sconces on the walls, a silken Persian carpet so pretty one dared not tread on it, and, in the middle, a brass brazier, now asleep. Somewhere a chime, caught in a breeze, tinkled dreamily. There was an intense silence throughout the house. Neither the voices of women from the harem side nor the clatter of a coach from the street. Even the cries of the seagulls did not seem to reach this roof. He wondered how Davud's wife had responded to the change, and to the new wives. It was one of those things in life he would marvel about, but never discover. In a while, another manservant arrived announcing that his master was ready to see him. Jahan followed him upstairs, one hand on the balustrade as if to draw strength from it. Davud had gained weight. Clad in an azure kaftan and a high turban, his beard trimmed round and short, he looked different. Sitting behind a walnut table, he was holding a plume, having just signed a document. 4 apprentices attended him, 2 on each side, their hands clasped, their heads bowed. They were similarly attired. When he saw Jahan enter the room on the heels of his servant, Davud stood up and broke into a smile. At last. An uneasy instant passed between them as Jahan puzzled over how to greet this man who until yesterday had been his friend but who was now his master. He was about to bow when Davud, having walked towards him, laid a hand on his shoulder. Outside this room I might be senior. Inside, we are friends. Relieved though Jahan was to hear this, his voice, when it came out, sounded hoarse, guilt-ridden. He offered his well wishes, apologizing for not having visited earlier. You are here now, Davud said. Jahan told him Yusuf had left the city, though he provided no details. If Davud suspected the truth about Sancha, he didn't give anything away. Instead he murmured, only 2 left. What do you mean? Out of 4, it's just you and me now. We are Sinan's heirs. We ought to support each other. A black servant walked in carrying a tray laden with drinks that he placed, quiet as a whisper, on a low table. The apprentices on the other side of the room stood utterly still. Like a row of saplings, Jahan thought, their roots boring holes in the carpet down to the ground floor. The rose sherbet was heavenly, served with cloves and chilled with crushed ice from the mountains of Bursa, a privilege exclusive to the wealthy. Next to it was a plate piled with 3 different kinds of baklava and a bowl of thick cream. No sooner had they downed their drinks than Davud said, "There's so much work, I can barely keep up. My wives complain. You are the chief royal architect, yet you don't even repair the fence around the house, they say." Jahan smiled. "I need an honest man like you by my side. Be my right hand. We'll do everything together. You'll be my head foreman." Beholden, Jahan expressed his gratitude. Simultaneously, he thought about his students at the palace school, realizing unhappily that he would have to stop teaching. His confusion must have been obvious, for Davud asked, "What is it? Do you find it difficult to receive orders from me?" "That's not true," Jahan said, although they both knew it was. "In that case there's nothing to discuss." Davud clapped his hands. "Now, eat." While they ate their baklava, Davud told Jahan about the changes he wished to introduce. With a series of rebellions and skirmishes racking the Anatolian plains, it was harder than ever to bring construction materials from the interior. Massive Friday mosques were not commissioned anymore. There was not enough in the coffers. Those days were over. Without the spoils of holy war, no sovereign could spend so much on constructions. For architecture in the capital to continue to prosper, wars had to be won near and far. "You see, our master died at the right time," Davud said wistfully. "He'd have been heartbroken if he were alive today." Outside the window, the sun was setting, painting the room a silken orange. They prattled on about which craftsmen they preferred to work with and which ones they would rather shun, banter that swirled with no immediacy and no weight, like wispy balls of dust. Soon a courier brought a letter, important, by the look of it. Davud sat at his desk, his apprentices on either side. Seeing how busy he was, Jahan rose to his feet. "Stay," Davud said into his inkpot. "Let's sup together. I wouldn't want to take your time." "I insist," said Davud. Having nothing to do, Jahan stood by the window for a while, watching a fishing boat glide with the pull of the current further and further away from the line where the sea lapped the shore. Slowly, he walked towards the bookshelves. In the corner, inhaling the fragrance of ink, vellum, paper, and time, he ran his fingers along the spines. He saw On War Against the Turk by this strange monk named Luther, and the book of the governor that an Englishman called Elio had dedicated to his king. He found treatises from the library of King Matthias of Hungary. And there, among the leather tomes, some thick, some thin, was Dante's La Divina Commedia, the gift he had received from Simeon the bookseller, and, after reading it again and again, he had given to his master. His hands trembling, he pulled it out, feeling the familiar heft of it, and he glanced through the pages. There was no doubt, it was his copy. Clearly, Davud had taken possession of Master Sinan's collection. A servant approached, lighting the candle in the sconce nearby. Jahan's shadow grew on the wall, tall and restless. He spotted the architecture of by Vitruvius, which he removed and held for a while, the book that had traveled from Buda to Istanbul. It was while he was returning it that he caught sight of a scroll at the back of the shelf, half squashed. He opened it, recognizing instantly the design of the Selimiye Mosque. He admired its magnificence now more than before. Jahan noticed marks made by another pen in lighter ink, as if someone had worked on it after the design had been completed, changing various sections of the construction. It must have been the master, he deduced. Probably Sinan had been studying why and where things had gone wrong. Jahan's eyes searched the border of the paper for a date. April 18, 1573. He tried to remember what they were doing on that day. Nothing came to mind. The murmurs in the background escalated as Davud, having finished his work, rained instructions on the servants about to prepare the dinner. Quickly, Jahan put the scroll back and joined him. They were served cold yogurt soup, followed by rice with lamb, capons stewed in sorrel sauce, pheasants cooked in beef broth, borek with mutton and a huge, oval platter of steaming meat, which he could not identify. This one was sent from heaven, Davud said, although it was improper for a host to boast about food. What is it? Jahan said, although it was improper for a guest to ask about food. Venison. Hunted yesterday. Jahan's stomach clenched as he recalled the stag he had seen in the forest while he was waiting for Sultan Suleiman. So as not to be rude, he forced himself to take a bite. It melts like sugar. I have observed that the quicker the animal dies the better the taste. Fear spoils the flavor. Jahan chewed, the deer a lump in his mouth. I didn't know you went hunting. Davud, having noticed Jahan's discomfort, moved the bowl away. Not I. I don't have the time for that. Don't think I have the heart either. As they were parting, Davud saw his guest to the door. Up this close, Jahan caught a scent on his friend's clothes, raw and leafy and strangely familiar. One that dissolved so fast in the night breeze that he didn't have time to remember when or where he might have smelled it before. Whenever Jahan could get away from his remaining classes at the palace school and his new construction work with Davud, he ran to Chota's side. Taking his designs with him, he drew in the barn, sitting on a pile of hay that the other tamers called, teasingly, the throne. Chota watched him, rapt, though Jahan wasn't sure whether he saw him. His eyesight, which had never been good, had deteriorated. Poor Abe was doing his best, and not because he feared Jahan's wrath but because he liked the white elephant. Despite his efforts, Chota had lost another tooth, one of his last three. He could neither chew nor bite any more. Jahan did not need to put him on those mammoth scales used by the sailors in the port of Karakoy to know that he had lost a lot of weight. Of late, Chota drowsed on his feet in fits and starts and lost his balance, jerking to and fro. While drinking water, taking a bath or plodding around the garden, his movements would slow down, his head would droop, and before he knew it he would be fast asleep, roaming the kingdom of dreams. It pained Jahan to see the elephant helpless and confused. A few times he caught him staring longingly at the linden tree, which he so loved to nibble. They mashed his food, leaves, nuts and apples, into pulp, mixed it with water and poured this concoction, with the help of a funnel, into his mouth. Though he spilled most, some of it reached his stomach. Chota did not attempt another escape, becoming more and more sedentary, refusing even the briefest excursion to the pond. Abe shoveled up his excrement, cleaned his trough, fed him milk and sherbets, but everyone was aware that the creature was melting. like a lump of wax over a fire. Back in the dormitory, Jahan found it hard to sleep. He tossed and turned, fretting over how Chota was doing. It was on one such sleepless night, surrounded as he was by the customary silence, that he began to think about his master's will. He could not believe that Sinan had not mentioned him or Chota in his last wishes. The master he had known and loved would have bequeathed something, however little or large, to the two beings who had worked with him so closely for so long. Sancha had taken away with her a box, a necklace and several designs, saying the master had given them to her. Wouldn't Sinan have left something to them too? Perhaps Sinan had, but no one had cared to tell Jahan about a matter this trivial. If the master had a final gift for Chota, Jahan wanted to learn about it without delay, for he had no doubt that the elephant was dying. Thus motivated, he went to see the chief white eunuch. I wanted to ask you about Master Sinan's will. Have you seen it? The man squinted, his blue eyes lined with coal. Why do you ask me? Because you are the highest palace official I can talk to. Well, I have seen the will. Jahan's face brightened. Was there any mention of Chota? Now that you ask, I remember him leaving a pretty mantle for the elephant. I'll make sure the beast receives it. Much obliged, said Jahan, frowning at his feet as if they annoyed him. How about me? For you, your master left his books. Then why didn't Master Davud tell me? I have seen Master Sinan's books in his house. Do you mean those books are mine? Those must be different ones, said Kamal Aga impatiently. Too many questions you ask, Indian. I'll see to it that they send you the mantle and whichever books are yours. Now go back. And stop spending so much time with that beast. You are an architect. Behave like one. Jahan nodded, but something was not quite right. The following afternoon, 3 weeks after Chota had escaped, Jahan came back from class to find Abe sitting on a rock, crying. The beast, Abe said, his sentence hanging in the air. Quietly, Jahan entered the barn. Chota was alone, inhaling with difficulty. Jahan rubbed his trunk with his palms, offered him water, which he declined. The elephant fixed his reddish-brown eyes on his tamer, and in those eyes Jahan saw traces of every road, long or short, that they had walked together. He remembered how Chota had disembarked from the ship 50 years ago, covered in dirt and faces, on the brink of collapse. I'm sorry, Jahan said, tears running down his face. I should have taken better care of you. He did not leave Chota's side that day and fell asleep beside him that night, listening to the animal's steady breathing. If he had any dreams, he did not recall them. In the morning he opened his eyes to the clack of a woodpecker on a nearby tree, like a message in cipher. Inside the barn it was silent. Jahan did not want to look at Chota, yet he did. The elephant was lying down, unmoving. His body was bloated, as if while he was asleep the wind had rushed through his trunk and blown him up. He should have a proper funeral, Jahan said to no one in particular, after he had washed, embalmed, and perfumed the animal, which tired him so much he had to rest for a while. Remembering how Nurbanu had preserved the body of Sultan Selim until his son reached the throne, he then found blocks of ice. Not that it helped. The elephant was too big, the ice too little. Still, he was adamant that the body should be preserved until a ceremony, befitting Chota's grandeur, was arranged. Within the hour his words had reached the ears of Carnation Kamal Aga. The man turned up in the menagerie, overseer of everything he was, including grief and madness. I hear now you have been asking for a right. Chota was sent by a great Shah to a great Sultan, said Jahan. He's a beast, said the chief white eunuch. A regal beast. More astonished than annoyed at this breach of manners, the chief white eunuch said, enough folly. Make your farewells. The French emissary is going to dissect him. Jahan let out a gasp of pain, as if punched in the gut. You mean cut him open? I'll never let him do that. It's the Sultan's wish. But does the Jahan could not finish. Does the Sultan know this is no ordinary animal? The question echoed in the deepest corners of his soul. He wished Master Sinan were alive, he would know what to do, how to speak. That same day Chota's body was bedecked with wreaths and garlands of flowers and loaded onto a carriage pulled by 5 oxen. In this state the elephant was paraded, one last time, through the streets of Istanbul. People craned their necks, awed and delighted. They clapped, cheered, and shouted. Leaving their tasks they followed the cart, often less out of pity than curiosity. Jahan rode ahead, staring straight into the horizon, over and beyond the sea of spectators. Not wishing to see anyone. Miserable, mournful, he reached the residence and there he delivered the elephant's body to the ambassador like a sacrificial lamb. To the butcher. The next day Jahan was summoned to the chamber of the chief white eunuch. His first thought was the man was going to reprimand him for staying in the menagerie the night Chota died. In the end, Jahan had defied his orders and refused to give the carcass to the French emissary, not that it had changed anything. The cutting had gone ahead. But it was enough to infuriate the chief white eunuch for years to come. Strangely, Jahan didn't care. A boldness that he had never known before had taken hold of him. Upon being ushered into his room, Jahan bowed, slowly and reluctantly, and waited, his eyes fixed on the marble floor. Lift your head. The order cracked like a whip. Jahan complied. And for the first time since he had arrived at the palace and was given an unforgettable slap by him, he stared straight into the chief white eunuch's eyes, the color of dark blue thistle. I've been watching you all these years. You have ascended fast. No other tamer has come close to what you have achieved. But that's not the reason why I am fond of you. Shall I tell you why? Jahan remained silent. He'd had no idea Kamal Aga was fond of him. Every Devsherm is made of melted steel. Ramolded. You are one of us. Indian. Strange thing is, no one converted you. You did it on your own. But you know where you made a mistake. I cannot say, Effendi. Love. The corners of his mouth turned down as if the word had left a sour taste on his tongue. There are plenty of apprentices in our city. Hundreds of them. They respect their masters. You loved yours. Same with the elephant. Your job was to look after him, make sure his belly was full. You loved the beast. It's not something I do consciously. It just happens. Don't love anyone too much. The eunuch's lips parted in a sigh. Since your master has gone, I shall take over as your guardian. Be faithful to me, and you won't suffer defeat. I am not in a war, Effendi. The man pretended not to hear this. I shall help you. There's a house where they wash off despair. They call it the Hammam of Sorrows. Jahan blinked, remembering the name from a moment in time so distant it might have been from a life not his own. We go there and we forget everything. Do you understand? Perplexed as he was, Jahan said he did. Good, get ready. I'll take you there tonight. After dark, a servant came to collect Jahan. A hulking, broad-shouldered man. deaf and mute like the rest. Jahan followed his torch across the courtyard, through a half-concealed back door. Nobody gave them so much as a glance. Had it not been for the flies circling their heads, charging blindly into their nostrils and mouths, and the sound their feet made as they scrunched along the gravel paths, he could have believed they were invisible. Above the city the sky was a mantle of velvet, a black so intense as to be blue. A carriage, pulled by 4 stallions, was waiting. Even in the dim light, Jahan could admire its gilded buckles, carved ivory panels, curtained windows that no eye could pierce. Inside sat the chief white eunuch, clad in a cape trimmed with ermine. As soon as Jahan settled in, the eunuch rapped the ceiling with his cane. Off they cantered. The carriage traveled with such speed and noise that Jahan was certain there were people watching them, bakers on their way to knead bread, mothers nursing sleepless babies, thieves running off with their haul, drunks downing their next bottle, or the pious up and about for an extra prayer. How many were aware of the chief white eunuch's nocturnal excursions and kept quiet about them? There were secrets a whole town might know about that still remained secrets. They got out near a back alley so narrow and dusky that Jahan hesitated to enter it. The coachman led the way with a lamp barely emitting any light. Dilapidated wooden houses, hunched up like old crones, loomed to their left and right. After what felt like eternity, they reached an ornamented gate. The chief white eunuch knocked 3 times with his ring, waited, then tapped twice with bare hands. "Hyacinth," said a voice from behind the door. "Hyacinth," repeated the chief white eunuch. For one stunned moment Jahan couldn't breathe. He had an awful suspicion. The eunuch knew the nickname his mother had given him as a boy. Unnerved, he had no desire to go inside with this man, but the gate had already opened. They were greeted inside by the shortest woman Jahan had ever come across. Barring her bosom, everything about her was tiny, her hands, her arms, her feet. She laughed. "Never seen a dwarf? Or never seen a woman?" Jahan blushed, which made her laugh louder. She turned to Kamil Aga, asking, "Where did you find him?" "Name is Jahan. He's an architect. Talented but soft." "Well, we've got the cure," she said. "Welcome to our hammam of sorrows." The chief white eunuch, familiar with his surroundings, plumped himself down onto large, bright cushions and ordered Jahan to follow suit. Before long, 5 concubines appeared, carrying musical instruments, lute, tambourines, lyre, and a reed pipe. His gaze slid from one face to the next, until it came to rest on the last woman. With her wide forehead, chiseled nose, sharp chin, and large hazel eyes, she bore a striking resemblance to Miramah. Jahan felt dizzy. As if she was aware of the effect she was having on him, she tilted her head in his direction and gave a smile, full of mischief. They began to sing a cheerful melody. On a silver tray the guests were served balls of paste, the color of saffron, the size of a walnut. Choosing one, Jahan held it carefully between his fingers. Kamil Aga took 3, which he swallowed one after another, and then reclined, eyes closed. Emboldened, Jahan popped his into his mouth. It tasted funny. Pungent and sweet at first, then spicy, like crushed seeds and wild marjoram. Next came the wine, carafes of red. He drank with caution at first, not trusting anyone. The dwarf lady sat beside him. "I heard you lost a loved one." "My elephant." Jahan waited for the chuckle that didn't follow. Instead she said, after she had filled his cup, "I know how it feels. I had a dog myself. When he died I was devastated. Nobody understood. It's just a hound, Zainab. What do they know? Better to make friends with animals than humans. You're right, Jahan said as he took another sip. Animals are more truthful. The music went on, accelerating. The tray with paste balls was brought back. This time Jahan took a larger one and washed it down with more wine. Hard as. He tried not to glance at the woman who so resembled Miramah, he could not help it. Even her seraphic smile, the slightest curl of her bottom lip, was exactly like hers. The billowing folds of her veil framed her face, translucent and light, like the morning mist. She seemed more at ease and confident than the other women. Perhaps she had less to worry about. It was Zainab's voice that brought Jahan back to his senses. You want me to show you his garments? What? My dog's clothes? You want to see them? I'd like to. The chief white eunuch, by now quite tipsy, frowned at them but said nothing. Glad to get out of his sight, Jahan followed Zainab into the recesses of the house. She led him into a vast room where everything was small, the bed, the low tables, the carpet. In one corner of the room there was a minuscule rosewood cabinet with dozens of drawers. It contained the smallest leather vests, furs, shawls. There was even a waistcoat of sorts. He must have been a boxy creature, for the articles were compact. Sniffing slightly, Zainab said he was only a puppy. When she found him, she had looked for his mother everywhere, eventually convinced that, just like her, the dog had no one to rely on. From then on they had been inseparable. Jahan handed her his handkerchief, which she took gratefully, and blew her nose. She stared at him as if seeing him anew. Put me up on this chair. She was light as a child. Her eyes fastened on him. She said, I have been in this trade for 30 years. Seen hell, seen heaven. Met angels, met demons. I survived because my lips are sealed. Never meddled in others' affairs. But I took a shine to you. You seem like a fine man. A rattle was heard from the next room. Perhaps a mouse was stuck between the floorboards. She dropped her voice to a whisper. The eunuch. Be careful with him. Why do you say that? Just beware, she said, jumping down from the chair. When they returned to the room the singing was still going on, though the tone had altered from gleeful to melancholy. Zainab sat beside the chief white eunuch and began to lavish praise, food, and wine on him. Jahan's eyes dropped as he slouched back. He could have fallen asleep if it hadn't been for a voice that hovered over the music. May I? It was her, Miramah's replica. Jahan's heart skipped a beat. She knelt in front of him, the sleeves of her dress sweeping his knees, and poured him a glass of wine. When he finished it, she took his shoes off, pressed his feet against her bosom and began, very gently, to rub. Panic rose inside Jahan. Like black bile. He was afraid of desiring her. He held her hands, whether to stop her from touching him or him from touching her, he couldn't tell. You like my hands? She asked. You remind me of someone. Really? Was it someone you loved? Jahan downed his next cup, and watched her instantly replenish it. Where is she now? Dead, he said. Poor darling. She kissed him. Her lips tasted like icy sherbet. Her tongue reached for his tongue and retreated. Despite himself Jahan was aroused. She held him tightly, pressing her palms on the nape of his neck. Suddenly Jahan realized everyone had vanished, the musicians, Zainab, the chief white eunuch. Where are they? Jahan asked, his voice full of unease. Calm down, everyone is in their room. We are good here. They kissed again. She guided his hands up and down her body, encouraging him to fondle her breasts, her hips, wide and round. He pulled up her skirts. Layers of taffeta ruffled under his weight. His fingers traveled between her legs, caressing her wet, dark cave. Panting, he was on top of her, undressing himself. Undressing her, unable to stop. "My lion," she whispered in his ear. He bit her neck, first gently, then harder. "Call me Mirama," she said, breathing heavily. A voice screamed inside Jahan's head. He shoved her away, unsteady as he tried to stand up. "How do you know her name?" She flinched. "You told me." "I did not." "You did. Just now, remember." Had he told her? He could not be sure. Seeing his bewilderment, she said, "The wine confused your mind." "You told me, I swear." He held his head between his hands, overtaken by a wave of nausea. Perhaps she was telling the truth. He would have believed her were it not for the slightest twitch of her jaw, a simple reflex or a sign of nervousness. "Go away, I beg," he said. "Don't be a child," she said with a scathing smile and pushed herself against him. Sucked into the softness of her bosom, he felt trapped, seizing both her wrists so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He seemed, for a moment, about to surrender to her charms. Instead he pushed her, too fast, too hard. She fell down heavily. A gasp rose from her lips, unfinished. Then silence. Jahan staggered, seeing, for the first time, the iron grate of the fireplace that she had fallen against, knocking her head. Before he could collect his thoughts, the door opened and Zainab entered the room, running, shouting. Bending over the woman, she listened for breath. Her face collapsed. "She's dead," Zainab cried. She turned to Jahan, her eyes wide with horror. "You've killed the eunuch's mistress." Jahan ran out of the room as fast as his legs could carry him, into the garden and through the dark alleyway, fearing that a shadow might pounce on him at any moment. By the time he reached the street, his forehead was beaded with sweat, and his chest was heaving so hard he was sure they could hear it back in the hammam of sorrows. No sooner had he taken a step than a wave of despondency hit him. He had nowhere to go. He could not return to the palace dormitory. That would be the first place the chief white eunuch would search. He could ask for help from the tamers in the menagerie, but he did not trust them all, and one betrayer was enough. Just as he was panicking, an idea surfaced in his head: David. His konak was large enough to hide in for a few days, if not weeks. Eminent and celebrated. David could even find a way to shield him from the wrath of the chief white eunuch. But he could not walk to up in the middle of the night. He needed a horse. The carriage that had brought them was waiting in a stable nearby. He headed in that direction, praying the coachman would be asleep. He was not. Truthfully, he was wide awake and in merry company. The man was following his master's example, while the chief white eunuch was roistering with hashish and wine. His servant was enjoying a frolic of his own. Jahan tiptoed quietly, although needlessly. The coachman and the whore were too lost in each other to notice him. The horses, though skittish, stood still and attentive, their ears pricked, their eyes alert, sensing what was taking place. Jahan approached one of the four mounts still fastened to the coach, a stallion greater than the cobblestones outside. Slowly, very slowly, he held its straps and escorted it towards the gate. In that instant, the coachman emitted a yelp of pleasure, his thrusts became urgent. Jahan pulled the animal by the reins. Harsher than he intended. The horse swung its head. Mercifully, it did not whinny. Jahan uttered a prayer. He must have chosen the most docile one of the pack. Still, he could not help but suspect a spirit was guiding him, Miramah's, or Nicola's or Master Sinan's. It could even be Chota's, for all he knew. He had many ghosts on every side. Before long he was riding at full speed, the wind thrashing his hair. He was no longer afraid of the jinn that dwelled in dusky corners, having accepted that they were less frightening than humans. Careful to stay in the dark, avoiding the watchman, he arrived at Davud's mansion. The servants, perplexed as they were to see a guest at this ungodly hour, took him upstairs to their master, who had already gone to bed. Davud shuffled his feet with a puzzled look. "Is everything all right?" "I beg your pardon, I had nowhere to go," Jahan said. Jahan accepted the musk sherbet a servant brought. His hands were trembling so badly that he spilled some of it on the carpet. He tried to wipe the stain off with his sleeve, which only made it worse. Unable to think straight anymore, he stared at the floor, seeing what he had failed to see the first time he had visited. Queer, the trivial details that caught one's attention when dreadful things were happening. He now saw that it was Master Sinan's carpet. "I've killed someone." Davud turned ashen. "Who? How?" "The chief white eunuch's mistress," Jahan said, unsure how to continue. He gave an account of the night, the dwarf lady, the musicians, the concubine who had tried to seduce him, and God knew had succeeded, though he did not mention her disturbing resemblance to Miramah. "I don't know." Jahan gulped for air. "Lately, things have been strange. I have the feeling it has something to do with Master Sinan." At this Davud raised an eyebrow. "The Master, may paradise be his abode, is beyond the trifles of this world." "Right, bless his soul. But I uphold his legacy." "You said so the other day." "There are only two of us now." Jahan paused, staring at his friend with a fixed intensity. "You might be in danger, too." Davud dismissed the idea with a sweeping motion of his hand. "Don't worry. Nothing can happen to me." "I killed her," Jahan said once more in a daze, rocking his body like a child in need of consolation. "I shall make inquiries tomorrow morning. You need to get some rest." Upon Davud's orders a bed was provided with bowls of sweetened figs and dates and a jug of boza. Jahan drank and ate little, after which he tumbled into a dark, disturbed slumber. He slept despite the demons preying on his soul. When he woke, it was high noon and there were brand new garments on the sofa. Donning them with gratitude, he went to see Davud, who was waiting for him downstairs with his 3 children, the youngest a girl not yet 4. The boys were the doubles of their father and clearly adored him. Jahan felt a pang of sorrow. He had neither a wife nor offspring. He had arrived in the city of shadows and echoes by himself. And, after so many years, here he was once again, alone. "I have bad news," whispered Davud, so as not to be heard by the children. "You were right, she died, it seems." Jahan gasped, struggling for air. Until then he had secretly hoped that it was a minor injury. "What are you going to do now?" Davud asked tenderly. "I can't stay in Istanbul. I'll have to go." "You can stay with us as long as you wish." Jahan's face broke into a smile. He was touched by Davud's generosity. Any other notable in his position would have shunned a man in trouble. True, he had come here intending to spend some time. Yet now, after seeing Davud with his young ones, he realized he could not put them in danger. I'm in your debt, but I should go. Better that way. Davud gave this some thought. There's an orchard near Thrace, belongs to my father-in-law. You'll be out of harm's way there while things simmer down. I'll give you a horse. Go and wait to hear from me. They decided it would be safer to set out in the dark. Jahan passed the day playing with the children, flinching at the slightest sound from outside. After supper, Davud gave him the steed, a cape to keep him warm and a pouch of coins. He said, keep your heart pure. You'll be back in no time. How will I ever repay you? We grew up together, Davud said. Remember what the master said? Not just brothers. You are the witnesses to each other's journeys. Jahan nodded, his throat tight. He remembered the rest too. You are the witnesses to each other's journeys. You will know, therefore, if one of you goes astray. Follow the path of the wise, the awakened, the loving, the hard-working. They embraced, and for a moment it was as if in their clasp there was an indistinct thump, a third heart beating next to theirs. It was as if Sinan, too, were there, watching, listening, praying. Jahan walked, slowly and steadily, among the shadows. He picked his way through the dark streets. This he had not told Davud, but he had decided not to leave Istanbul without paying a last tribute to Chota. He reached the French ambassador's residence. Improper as it was to visit an emissary, or anyone uninvited, he hoped to be forgiven. The servant who answered the door thought differently. His master liked his sleep and could not possibly be disturbed. But Jahan was persistent. Between the two of them they raised such a racket that soon a sleepy voice rose from inside the house. Who is it, Ahmed? Some insolent pauper, master. Give him bread and send him away. He doesn't want bread. He says he needs to talk to you about the elephant. Oh. There followed a brief silence. Let him in, Ahmed. Without a wig and powder, wearing a nightgown that reached his knees and revealed the enormity of his belly, the figure Jahan found in the hall didn't quite resemble the ambassador he knew. I beg your pardon for intruding on you, Jahan said, bowing low. Who are you? The ambassador asked. I'm the mahout of the elephant you have cut, your excellency. I see, Monsieur Breves said, remembering the brazen tamer who had reluctantly handed him the corpse. Jahan blurted out the lie he had prepared on the way. Last night I had a horrible dream. The poor elephant was in pain and begged me to lay him to rest. But that has been done, Monsieur Breves said. The corpse had started to stink, I'm afraid. We buried the beast. A stab of sorrow entered Jahan's chest. Where is his grave? The man didn't know. He had asked his servants to get rid of the carcass and so they had. When he noticed Jahan's sadness, he said, cheer up, my friend. Come, there's something I'd like to show you. Together they entered a room overflowing with books, notes and mementos. Monsieur Breves, unlike other envoys, who were mostly interested in power struggles, had a great knowledge of the Ottoman Empire and spoke impeccable Turkish, Arabic and Persian. Having studied the written works, he was keen to establish an Arabic printing press in Paris to help books to travel as freely as ambassadors did. Jahan now understood why his appearance at his door unbidden hadn't angered Monsieur Breves. In truth, he was glad to have found someone with whom he could talk about the dissection he had conducted. Burning to relate his achievements, he handed Jahan the sketches he had drawn. While not a fine artist, he had nonetheless set down in great detail the anatomy of an elephant. One day, I shall write a treatise, he said. People ought to know. It's not every day that they get to see the inside of such a magnificent creature. Involuntarily, Jahan's eyes slid to a shelf where a tusk shone, bright and polished. The ambassador, following his gaze, said, "A keepsake from Constantine. May I hold it?" Jahan asked, and when he was given the nod he took it with care. A wave of gloom swept through him. His eyes brimmed with tears. Monsieur Breves regarded him silently, his face twisting as he quarreled with himself. In the end he sighed and said, "I think you should take the tusk." "Really? Clearly you loved the beast more than anyone," the ambassador said, waving his hand in a gesture of nonchalance or commiseration or both. "I have my drawings. That'll be enough to impress everyone in Paris." "I am grateful," Jahan said, his voice breaking. Jahan set off with the tusk in his hand. In comparison with the night before, he was more hopeful. The tusk radiated a glow that warmed his soul. It was as if Chota were with him. On his shoulder he carried a rucksack with a few items that Monsieur Breves had allowed him to take, a shovel, a candle, a red scarf, and a string. Jahan had a plan. Back on his horse he rode with purpose. When he reached the Miramah Mosque, he jumped off and walked along the outside walls. He spotted a Judas tree flushed with rosy blossoms. By that patch he dug a deep, rectangular pit. He could have kept the tusk with him, but that would have been selfish. Chota deserved to have a headstone. It was always the sultans and the viziers and the opulent who had lofty monuments to their names. The poor and the destitute would have had nothing, once they were gone, were it not for the prayers of their kith and kin. Every mortal being left behind a mark, no matter how small or ephemeral, except animals. They served, they fought, they put their lives in danger for their masters, and when they died it was almost as if they had never existed. Jahan didn't want Chota to meet the same end. He wanted him to be remembered with appreciation and love. Perhaps it was blasphemy, but he didn't care. It pained him to think that Chota could not go to heaven. If people prayed for him, he thought, the elephant had a better chance of ascension. He carefully laid the tusk inside the hole. "Farewell. I'll see you in paradise. I hear they have nice trees to eat." In that moment a strange calmness came over him. He was, for the first time, at peace with himself. He was part of everything and everything was part of him. So this was it, he thought. Center of the universe was neither in the east nor in the west. It was where one surrendered to love. Sometimes it was where one buried a loved one. Shovel by shovel, he covered the hole until it was smooth. Then, using the strings, he hemmed in the pit. Where he imagined Chota's head would have been, he stuck in a dry branch and tied it with the scarf. Next to it he placed the candle. He sat by it, cross-legged, bolt upright. Now all he needed to do was to wait for someone, anyone, to walk by. It did not take long. A young, willowy goatherd approached. He stared at the grave, then at Jahan, then back at the grave again. "What is this, Effendi?" "It's a tomb." The youngster's lips moved in a quick invocation. When he finished, he asked, "Who died? Anyone familiar?" "Hush. Be respectful." The goatherd's dark eyes widened. "Who was it?" "A saint. A powerful one." "Never heard of a saint in this area." He did not want to be known for 100 years. "Then how is it that you know?" "He revealed his tomb to me in a holy dream." Kneeling beside Jahan, the goatherd tilted his head to the side, as if hoping to get a glimpse of the corpse under the earth. Does he cure any diseases? He cures everything. My sister's barren. Been married for 3 summers, still waiting. Bring her here. The saint might help. Bring her husband, too, in case it is him. What's he called? Chota Baba. Chota Baba, the goatherd repeated deferentially. Slowly, Jahan stood up. I must go. Keep an eye on this grave. Make sure no one disrespects him. You are the guardian of the shrine of Chota Baba. Can I trust you? The goatherd nodded solemnly. Don't be worrying yourself, Effendi. I shall keep my word. This is how the city of 7 hills and 100 shrines, old and very old, Muslim, Christian, Jewish and pagan, gained yet another saint to visit at times of desperation, at times of joy. After riding the entire afternoon, Jahan arrived at a crossing where the road forked. The path to his right led northwards over dried-up riverbeds to Thrace. This was the route Davud had counseled him to take. The path to his left meandered westwards through flatlands and rolling hills. It was more splendid, greener, prettier, yet less preferable, since it was not only circuitous and rugged, but also dangerous, with bandits roaming its woods. Jahan was about to turn right as planned when a thought occurred to him. If Chota were alive, he would have plumped for the other path, he knew. And without premeditation and for no particular reason, so did he. For a while he rode at a canter, drinking in the landscape. The air smelled of pine, mud, and dampness. Guided by a strange instinct, he roamed about, deviating from the agreed course. Soon the sun went down and the moon, a thin, pale crescent, rose in the east. That was when Jahan recalled the inn that he and Davud had dined in as young, excited apprentices, on their way back from Rome. If memory served him correctly, it was in this area. By the time he found the inn, darkness had descended. A groom took his horse to the stable while he made his way inside. Everything was exactly the same, the stuffy rooms upstairs, the vast, noisy dining hall downstairs, the strong odor of roasted meat. The unchanging nature of the place should have come as a comfort, a sweet reassurance in a world where everything was disappearing, but it didn't. Instead it filled him with an immense despair. His mind was awash with images of the hammam of sorrows. The face of the concubine, as she leaned over him in a kiss, transformed into the face of Miramah. Even though he knew this was impossible, there was a part of him that felt he had killed his beloved and that, secretly, he had wanted this. He sat at a rough-hewn table near the stone fireplace, full of feverish thought, listening to the crackle of the logs over the din of laughter and gossip. How Siboi scurried left and right, brothers by the looks of them. In a little while, a young lad came to take his order. Having a cheerful, chirpy mien, he asked Jahan who he was and where he was going. In his eyes Jahan saw the sparkle he'd had when he was the boy's age, a reckless curiosity for the world and a hidden wish to leave one's place of birth in the belief that real life was elsewhere. When the lad brought him his stew, a steaming pot of beef and vegetables in a thick, spicy broth, Jahan said, "Last time I came here you were not yet born." "Really?" the lad said, intrigued. "My pa must have taken care of you." "Where is he?" Jahan asked between mouthfuls. "Oh, he's around. A bit hard of hearing in his right ear. The left is fine. I'll tell him about you. These days all he does is talk about the past." Nodding, Jahan went back to his stew. As he was wiping the bowl clean with a hunk of bread, the innkeeper appeared. He had gained weight and had a belly the size and shape of a barrel. Jahan watched the lad point in his direction, saying something in his father's ear. In a second the man was by Jahan's side. "My boy tells me you're an architect and that you were here way back." "That's right, I was here with my friend," Jahan said, raising his voice. The man squinted and stood ramrod straight for a moment too long. Then he said slowly, "I remember." Jahan didn't believe him. How could he have any recollection of them, when he had seen hundreds of customers come and go? As if he had read this disbelief. The innkeeper sat opposite him and said, "I did not forget you too because of that companion of yours. Strange fella, that one." I thought to myself, are these friends or foes? Perplexed, Jahan stared at him. "What do you mean?" He asked for a cleaver. I said, "What are you going to do with it? We get all sorts of rogues here, don't want trouble." How was I to know he wouldn't sink it into someone? He promised to return it. And he did, in truth. Jahan pushed aside his empty plate, suddenly nauseated. But the expression on the man's face said he hadn't finished. I was suspicious. I peeked from the door. "You were downstairs." "Everyone was." "What did you see?" Jahan asked. "Your friend," he said, pronouncing the last word mockingly, "was cutting up a book. Leather cover it had. He chopped at it like it was some tree." "We were robbed," Jahan said. "My drawings, my journal. All were gone." "No, Effendi. Nothing stolen in my inn. We run a decent place." "Your friend destroyed your things." "God knows what he did with the pieces." "But, why would he do that?" "Ha! If you find out, come tell me, cause I have been wondering that myself." After the man left, Jahan ordered some ale, which they brewed in this region. He shuddered, as if the wind outside were blowing through his bones. When he finished his drink, he left a generous tip and went back to the stable. "Has my horse been fed and watered?" "Yes, Effendi." "Saddle it up." "You leaving?" "There's a storm coming. The forest is dangerous at night." "Not going into the woods," Jahan said. "I'm returning to the city." Through rows of elms and over bubbling brooks, he rode back to Istanbul, the storm chasing him like a hound nipping at his heels. His horse started at each crack of thunder, the storm grew closer and louder at every turn. Somehow he managed not to get caught in the rain, fleeing the leaden clouds following behind. He charged into fields of black, a black so complete and absolute as to suck up all other shades, one after another. He wondered if this was what death would be like. If so, it didn't feel frightening, only profound. Jahan raced across a valley strewn with huge boulders that resembled, from a distance, old men huddling for warmth. As he passed by, he had the odd feeling that they were watching him with the dull stare of those who, having seen too many excitements that ended in disaster, had none left of their own. Near Istanbul, the storm skewed right, cutting off his path and reaching the city ahead of him. A lightning bolt struck far off, washing the domes and hills with a bright blue luster. In that blaze of light, descending almost vertically, it felt like the skies had opened up to reveal the vault of heaven, if only for the briefest moment. Once again Jahan thought to himself what a beautiful city this was, however stony-hearted. Soon the sodden ground under his horse's hooves turned into cobbled roads. He headed to the Belgrade Gate, the one entrance that he guessed would not be closed at this hour. He was right. A company of Janissaries stood sentinel with their shields and swords and high headwear. One of them was dozing on his feet. Jahan told them. He was a teacher at the palace school and showed them his seal. They questioned him suspiciously but not altogether disrespectfully, in case he might have connections high up in the Seraglio. Finally, bored, they let him go. For a while Jahan rode watching the sea, now the color of ink, in the distance. The gale, fast and furious, blew down the gables, snapped the saplings, churned the waves. All at once, it started to pelt down. The little day of judgment, the locals called such squalls of lashing rain, the world rehearsing for the final deluge. Hard as Jahan tried to keep to under the eaves as he rode, by the time he reached Davud's mansion he was soaked to the bone. A dog barked. Somewhere, a man yelled in an unfamiliar language. Then came silence, enhanced rather than disturbed by the constant noise. When he had visited this place earlier, he had not paid attention to how well it was protected: lofty walls, iron gates, a hedge of shrubs. He recalled Davud's words, "My wives complain. You are the chief royal architect, yet you don't even repair the fence around the house, they say." Tethering the horse to a post, he walked towards the fence around the back garden, searching for the section in need of repair. He found a place where a few of the pales had buckled and crumbled. After prodding a bit, 2 of them gave way, making a hole big enough to pass through. The garden welcomed him with its heady fragrances. He paced back and forth, deciding how best to break into the house. It was easier than he had thought. Jahan knew that a well-fortified house had, in general, but one flaw: an owner's hubris. Confident that no thief would ever breach its defenses, such a place was not checked regularly. In time, even the highest wall crumbled, the sharpest spike lost its edge. Through a wooden hatch that turned out to be fortuitously loose on its hinges, he crept in and found himself in what seemed to be, or what smelled like, the pantry. As his eyes got used to the gloom, he was able to move about in slow, steady strides. Surrounded by crocks of honey and molasses, kegs of goat's cheese and butter, strings of dried vegetables and fruit, pots of grain and nuts, he could not help but smile at what Chota might have done with such food. He remembered the night when he had sneaked into the royal observatory, his heart thumping. Everything was different back then. His master was alive and thriving, Chota was alive, and he was a man in love. Down the corridor, ensconced in a niche, a lamp glowed faintly. Jahan took it and made his way upstairs. The room he and Davud had dined in the other day looked larger, as if it expanded after dusk. He approached the bookshelves, not knowing what he was searching for but trusting that he would recognize it once he found it. He hadn't had a chance to inspect the scrolls, and this was what he set about doing now. Unrolling one of them, he studied it. Nothing unusual. He spent less time with the next 2 drawings, one of a bazaar, the other of a lazaretto. Deep from the bowels of the house came a rustle as light as the wing beat of a moth. His back stiffened. He grew still, listening. Not a sound. Only the dark and its numbing calmness. He opened a roll of paper, recognizing his master's handwriting. "My faithful apprentice Jahan. I came to see you today, was not allowed. It is the second time they have blocked my way. The Grand Vizier's orders, so I am told. I shall try to reach our Sultan and get special permission. Until then I shall send you this letter so that you know I pray for your well-being, my son, and that while you spend your days inside those walls, I have no joy outside." Jahan gasped. He had come, after all. His master had visited him in the dungeon. He had tried to reach him and failed. Instantly another thought followed. Why? Had he not received this letter? What, or who, had kept the letter away from him all this time? His hands trembled as he inspected the next scroll, the design of the Kirksesma aqueducts. The site of their third major accident, the one that had killed 8 workers, among them Salahaddin. Once again he saw his master's handwriting, the gentle strokes of his gold-nibbed pen. Upon his penmanship, in a slightly different shade, was a second imprint, similar to the lines he had found on the scroll of the Suleymaniye Mosque. He examined the scratch marks, all of which happened to be the spots where the injuries had occurred. In the third design, that of Molla Salebi Mosque, Jahan caught a detail that almost choked him. Till then he had focused on the areas around the scaffolding. Yet here there were markings on the half-dome over the mihrab. A memory floated into his head. He remembered how Sancha, her face ashen, her accent lilting and her shadow long in the grass, had told him the story of her capture as they sat in that location. He recalled the men, one of them Salahaddin's brother, prowling about while she was talking, and his feeling that something about them was not quite right. At the time he and Sancha had taken them for petty thieves stealing materials from construction sites. It happened often. There was no end to the things people ran off with, mostly out of poverty, sometimes for the sheer pleasure of it. Now he understood those men had been there to sabotage the building as part of another plot. They had been waiting for him and Sancha to leave. But since they stayed, they had unknowingly prevented them from doing what they had been ordered to do. Instead, the accident had occurred on the other side of the prayer hall. Somebody had been taking notes on Master Sinan's designs not after the incidents, in order to study where things had gone wrong, but before. In his dismay, Jahan dropped the scroll, cursing his clumsiness. He got on his knees to pick it up and was still hunched over when 3 pairs of feet entered the room. Davud, wearing a nightgown, a servant on each side, stood opposite him. "Look what the night has brought us." "Thought it was a burglar, but it's a friend." Slowly, Jahan stood up. He would make no attempts at denial. "What were you looking at?" "Molla Salebi Mosque," Jahan said, his forehead breaking out in a sweat. "Not one of our best, but surely the prettiest we made," Davud said with a smile that quickly vanished. When he spoke again his voice sounded husky and hard. "I should have destroyed those drawings long ago, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. They reminded me of our old days, our golden times. It was a mistake, I now see. Look what my softness cost me." Involuntarily, Jahan glanced at the men behind him, their eyes gleaming in the light of the candles they carried. A barb of fear entered his stomach as he recognized one of them, the deaf mute who had ushered him into the chief white eunuch's carriage only a few days before. It now felt like another life. "Why did you come back? Have I not provided you with a fast horse and a safe place?" Davud asked. Jahan responded tartly, "You did. To get me out of your way, I suppose. Be grateful. Only Shaitan lacks gratitude. What I don't understand is why you said you wanted me to be your foreman. Why the charade?" "Because I did, Allah is my witness. At first I thought we could work together. You ruined everything, you were asking too many questions about the masters. Well, why don't you ever accept things as they are?" Davud stared past Jahan towards the window. Rain was beating against it relentlessly. "You were always like this," he muttered, sounding weary, disappointed almost. "Too curious for Your own good. The chief white eunuch and you are accomplices. Accomplices, Davud echoed. Such a harsh thing to say. What would you call it? Ignoring the question, Davud went on, I told him it was not a good idea to take you to that house of sin. He didn't listen. He thought he could buy you off with harlots and hashish. He stared at Jahan as if for solace. If he had let me handle it, none of this would have happened. Master was always worried he was losing his designs. But he wasn't. You were stealing them, Jahan said. And the accidents. You planned them. Salahaddin's brother. That lad worked for you. He never understood it was you who had killed his brother. How many others have you deceived? How could you? There was a brief silence until Davud turned towards his servants and said, Go, wait outside. If both men were deaf and mute, which Jahan knew they were, they must have been trained to read lips, for they left immediately. It was just the two of them. Now, the room felt colder and darker, too, as the servants had taken their candles with them. The shy, small lamp Jahan had brought from downstairs was there. Only light. It was you, all along, Jahan said, his mouth parched. When we were repairing the Hagia Sophia, you talked with the locals and things got worse. What did you tell them? The truth, Davud said, spitting the words from his lips like a fire spitting embers. Told them they were being kicked out of their houses so that the Sultan and his puppets could enjoy the sight of an infidel shrine. Davud paused, as if washed by memories. You and Nicola were so gullible. I bribed those children. Told them they should drag you two into their shed, show you their sick father. The kittens. I knew you would be touched. You knew we would be angry at the master, Jahan said. You betrayed him. Davud gave a look that was nigh on painful. I did no such thing. You have done everything you could to harm him, is this not treachery? No, Davud said calmly. It is not. Trying to suppress the quiver in his voice, Jahan said, when we were in Rome, we saw a painting. A disciple who had turned traitor. Didn't you find yourself in him? I remember the painting. But I was no disciple and our master was no Jesus. That man, Tommaso. The Italians. Were they after master's designs or was it just a ruse of yours? Tommaso, yes. Greedy man, but too small, insignificant. I used him for a while. Afterwards there was no need. Until that moment Jahan had seen a mix of emotions on Davud's face, rage, sorrow, resentment. The one thing he had not observed was regret. Do you feel any remorse at all? Remorse, for what? You want to believe I'm dishonorable. Shaitans. Henchman, Davud's voice waned, then rose again. True, I lied to our master. I pretended I had a family back in the village. I wrote them letters, sent them gifts. It was a sham. I don't understand. Davud laughed an unhappy laugh. I have no kin back in the village. All slaughtered by your great Sultan. Which one? Does it matter? Davud said with an impatient gesture. Are they not the same? Suleiman. Salim. Murad. The father, the son, the grandson. Don't they keep repeating what their ancestors did? I feel sad about what happened to your family, Jahan said. It was Sultan Suleiman. We'd had a poor harvest, another one, could not pay the levy. We were not Shias, but many said that come the winter we should pack up and go to the Shah of Iran. Better over there than here. Our poets recited, our women sang. Your Sultan wanted to teach us a lesson. He did. I was 10 years old. Outside the rain slackened to a drizzle. Jahan could hear a fishing boat splashing nearby. They beheaded a few. Left them on pikes for 3 days. More people rebelled. Their bodies dangled in the wind for a week. Still see them in my dreams. Everyone rebelled. They came back. This time they razed the village. How did you survive? My mother pushed me into the larder, closed the door on me. I waited. I was more hungry than afraid. Stupid boy. When I walked out it was night time. I saw the moon shine on corpses. My brothers, my uncles, my mother. It was a while before Jahan spoke again. Why didn't you tell Master Sinan? He would have helped you. Really? Davud gave him a disdainful look. Did Master resurrect the dead? Is he like Jesus in that way? Master loved you like a son. I loved him like a father. A father in the wrong. A great architect. But a coward. Never uttered a word against cruelty or injustice. Even when you were rotting in the dungeon he did not move a finger. Have mercy. What could he have done? It was not in his power. He could have said to the Sultan, let go of my apprentice, my lord, or else I'm not building for you. Have you lost your mind? He'd have been put to death. It'd have been a decent end, Davud countered. Instead he wrote you miserable letters. You knew about it? Jahan's face fell as he took this in. He trusted you with the letters. You told him you had found a way to send them to me in the dungeon, but you never did. You wanted me to be cross with my master. Davud shrugged as if the remark had no relevance. All he wanted to do was build one project after another. But who will pray in those mosques? Will they be unwell or hungry? Didn't matter. Every year, work, work. Where do the resources came from? Another war. Another slaughter. Did he mind? He didn't care for anything else. That's not true. Every colossal mosque we built was raised thanks to the revenues from another conquest. On their way to the battleground the army would raze villages to the ground, kill more of my people. Our master never cared for these sorrows. He refused to see that, without bloodshed elsewhere, there would be no money. And without money there would be no building in the capital. Enough. Davud dropped his voice, speaking gingerly, as if addressing a petulant boy. You come from another land. You can't understand this. Jahan's shoulders slumped. You were not the only one making up stories. I'm an orphan. I've never seen Hindustan. Never kissed a Shah's hand. It was a lie. Davud studied him. The master knew it? I believe so. He protected me. The elephant. Destiny, Jahan said. God brought us together. So we had one thing in common. Still, you are not me. Davud broke off. There are two kinds of men, this I have learned. Those who covet happiness. Those who seek justice. You long for a happy life, whereas I long for Adalet. We shan't agree. Jahan strode to the door. Davud shouted, where do you think you're going? Don't want to be near you. Fool. I cannot let you go. Until then, it had not occurred to Jahan that Davud could harm him. As if to help him comprehend this, Davud said, you know too much now. Jahan opened the door. The two servants were there, blocking his way. They pushed him back into the room. Tell your dogs to leave me alone, Jahan yelled. Pity it had to be this way, said Davud as he left the room. Farewell, Indian. Jahan was so perplexed it took him a moment to act. He began to shout at the top of his voice. Surely there were people in the house who would hear and come to see what was happening. His children, his wives, his concubines. Help! Somebody help! One of the men shoved him with such force that he fell down. Jahan tried to pray, but the words would not come. He took deep breaths, ready for the strangling that was sure to follow. It did not. Outside a bird warbled a song. The dawn was breaking. They hit him on the back of his head with something hard, heavy. The floor tilted beneath his feet. The birds chirping was the last sound he heard before everything went dark. There was a mantle, stiff and heavy as brocade, wrapped around his head, choking his breath, blocking his view. He wanted to take it off, but his hands were tied, as were his feet. Through a slit in the fabric he glimpsed his surroundings, blurred as they were, slowly realizing there was nothing on his face. It was his eyes that were not seeing. The right one was swollen, unblinking, shut. The left one, half open, fluttered in a lonely panic to make sense of where he was. Jahan tasted blood in his mouth. He must have bitten his tongue during the fight. For there was a fight, he remembered. His body remembered, the soreness in his limbs, the ache in his knuckles, the throb that still drilled a hole in his skull and, worst of all, the pain that shot through his right foot. His cheek stung, though he would not discover the reason until later. He recalled how Dabud had walked out of the room, leaving him at the mercy of his guards, and how everything had stopped. The next thing he knew, he was in a carriage that was riding hell for leather. The deaf-mutes, one on each side, had not expected him to recover consciousness so soon. They began to hit him again. Jahan fought back. In a frenzy, he opened the door and jumped out of the carriage with its horses still galloping at full speed. He tumbled into a ditch, twisting his foot. Such was the state the deaf-mutes found him in. Then it went pitch black again. His chest hurt now as he drew in a gulp of stale, sour air. His fingertips touched the hard surface, confirming what he suspected. He was lying on an earthen floor, bundled up in a hut somewhere. There was a persistent susurration in the distance, which he found oddly calming. He must have passed out, he couldn't tell for how long. When he came around, it was so cold his teeth were chattering. Either his other eye had also closed or the night had descended. The first time he soiled his shalwar, the shame was worse than the stench. None of that mattered afterwards. The hunger he could deal with for a while. The thirst was dreadful. Thirst hewed his flesh, bit by bit, the way an axe would eat into a log, hacking its way into his veins. He kept smacking his lips as if he had been served a delicacy. That made him laugh. He feared he was losing his mind. The incessant swish in the background he later recognized to be the sea, a discovery that was soothing and frightening in equal measure. Soothing, for he had always loved the ocean. Besides, he was probably not far from Istanbul. Frightening, because it brought to mind stories of concubines being fed to the fish. He shouted for help, over and over again. No one came. If Chota were here, he would tell him how peculiar it was to die alone and unheard in a city this crammed and clamorous. As he drifted in and out of a stupor, time dragged on. In between bouts of pain, he nodded off, waking with a start, as though his soul refused to admit defeat. An anger he knew not from whence got hold of his soul. He, the apprentice to the great Sinan, had not climbed all that way to end so low. Sundered as they were, he could not for a moment believe Davud would abandon him to death. And yet Davud did not arrive. Nor did his underlings. Jahan could not guess whether it was dawn or dusk. Or how much time had gone by since he had been dragged here. How many days could a human being survive without water, he wondered. Elephants could make it up to 4, he had read. He had no clue whether he would fare better. He dreamed of Mirama, laughing under a honeysuckle vine, 13 years old again. Her body untouched by hands other than her own, her face unmarred by spleen, her soul unspoiled by ambition. The way she had been when they first met, a happy, happy girl. Come, she whispered, extending her hand. Jahan attempted to move towards the garden where she waited. But halfway through something distracted him. A noise coming from the other side. Footsteps. Not by the door, though. Somebody was trying to break in. There was a loud, sharp clank, the sound of a boring tool on wood. The window must have been opened, since a cool, crisp draft swirled in. Clear, a voice said. Go. Something heavy landed on the floor with a thud. A man. Another followed suit. The two intruders tiptoed around, unaware of Jahan's presence. The lamp they carried illuminated a tiny patch. Find that trunk. It must be here. Oak, what's this smell? A dead rat, I'd say. You sure there's treasure in this hollow? How many times have I told you? Those two oafs were carrying something big. Seen it with me own eyes. Sober eyes or drunk eyes. I know what I'm sayin', dolt. There's a secret here. Thieves? Jahan shuddered. They could cut him to pieces. Still, he had nothing to lose. He was dying anyhow. A dry croak rose from his lips. What was that? What was what? Jahan's breath rasped in his throat. Who's there? One of them yelled, his voice dripping with fear. If Jahan didn't say a word, they would beat a hasty retreat, taking him for a Gilyabani asterisk. Help, Jahan pleaded. It didn't take them long to find him amid the boxes and crates. Surrendering to his fate, Jahan slipped into blankness but came to, trembling. One of the men was holding him by the shoulders and shaking him like the branches of some mulberry tree. What are you doing? Poor fella's been clobbered enough. Trying to wake him up. Yeah, well done. Now he's totally smacked. You wake him, then. Go get some water. They poured a bucket of seawater on Jahan's head, the salt burning the cuts and grazes on his skin, drilling down to his bones. He moaned in pain. Just then another voice was heard, gruff and strangely familiar. Hey, what's goin' on? We found this one here. Looks like someone roughed him up, chief. Footsteps drew closer. The man is dying of thirst, mutton heads. They've pummeled him like a dirty old rug, and what do? Pour seawater on his wounds. Step back. Stay away, butchers. Jahan heard the thump of a flask being opened. Wetting his handkerchief with sweet water, the man pressed it to his lips. More, Jahan begged as he strove to suck the cloth. Brother, take it easy. Not so fast. They began to wipe his face, curious to see the star-crossed soul underneath. The blood and the mud and the grime. Jahan wanted to say something, but it was too exhausting, every word, every gasp. His head drooped. God Almighty! Bring that lamp closer, the same voice bellowed. May the sky fall on our heads, it's Jahan. He's got no wits, this man. A snail nose. Better. I find him freezing in water, I meet him in the dungeon, now he's in with the rubbish. Always in trouble. Jahan stammered, "Ba, Laban." "Indeed, brother." Jahan burst out laughing, the cackle of a madman. "He's lost his little mind, chief," said one of the gypsies. "Poor chap," said the other. To both of which Balaban shook his head and said tenderly, "Nay, he's got an elephant's strength, our brother. He'll be fine." Freeing him from his ropes, they helped Jahan to stand up, though he could not walk. His right foot was a mess of empurpled flesh, swollen to twice its size. They grabbed him, a man under each arm. As soon as they stepped outside, the wind pricked his skin like splintered glass. He didn't mind. It was over. Once again in his life, just as he was going down fast, ready to cross to the other side, a gypsy's hand had pulled him back, pulled him up. Balaban's wife, taking Jahan into her care, applied a poultice to his wounds and pigeon dung to his cuts. Morning and evening she forced down his throat a brew that was the color of rust and tasted no better. The cut on his cheek, which bled whenever he moved a muscle, had to be sewn, she declared. So she did, her fingers not trembling once, even when he screamed and kicked in agony. When done, she assured him that from now on he would have lovers galore, since women were fond of men scarred on the battlefield. "I was in no battle," Jahan protested weakly. "Who's going to know that? They'll drop in your path like ripe plums. Mark my words," she said, spitting in her palm and stamping it on the wall. "But your foot looks bad. We've summoned the mender." "Who's that?" "You'll see," she said mysteriously. "When he's done, you'll be as good as the Almighty first made you. Stubby and scraggy as a reed, dressed in tatters and with a wooden spoon dangling from his neck." The man who showed up the same afternoon didn't seem at all remarkable to Jahan. How wrong he was. With a quick glance at Jahan's foot, the healer declared it was not broken but badly dislocated. Before Jahan could ask what that meant, he had shoved the spoon in Jahan's mouth, taken his foot in the hollow of his hand and twisted it. Jahan's scream was loud enough to frighten the pigeons in the courtyard of the Suleymaniye Mosque. Later the mender would show him the teeth marks on the spoon. Apparently, his weren't the only ones. "All broken bones?" Jahan asked when he could speak again. "Those and women giving birth. They bite harder. Keep an eye on your piss," continued the mender. He explained there were 6 shades of yellow, 4 of red, 3 of green and 2 of black. A healer would not waste time looking at the patient, he would inspect his urine and see what was wrong. At his behest Jahan peed in a pot and watched the man swirl, sniff, and swallow the liquid. "No hidden bleeding in the organs," said the mender. "Advent of dropsy. Prone to melancholy. Otherwise, fine inside." Thus sewn, fixed, washed, fed, and tucked up in bed, Jahan slept uninterrupted for 2 days. On the third afternoon, when he opened his eyes, he found Balaban by his bed, weaving a basket while waiting for him to come round. "Welcome to the land of the living. Wonder where I'll save your skin next time." Jahan chuckled, although it hurt because of the stitches in his face. "How is the elephant?" "Chota is dead." "Sorry, brother." "How sad." They were pensive for a moment. Jahan was the first to break the silence. "Do animals go to heaven, you think?" "Imams say they won't." "What do they know about animals?" "Farmers do. Gypsies do. But imams, nay." Balaban paused. "Don't brood. When I go to heaven, I'll have a word with God. If he says there's no room for creatures, I'll beg him to spare Chota. Jahan's eyes lit up with amusement. You steal. You drink. You gamble. You bribe. You still think you're going to paradise. Well, brother. I look at the holier than thou. I say to myself, if these chaps are goin', I sure am goin', 'cause they are no better than me. That's how I measure my sins. Balaban poured himself some wine. Pity he won't see his father. Who? Your elephant's son. Chota has a son. Tacho, you thought all that effort brought no result. Poor Gulbahar was pregnant forever. Did you know? Yes, Jahan said, nodding. They have long pregnancies. Long? Seemed like an eternity. What did you name him? Remember, you told me 4 elephants held the universe. If one moved, there were earthquakes, you said. Balaban took a sip. I named him Panjay. It means 5. Just in case, you know, someone should stand in the center. Jahan's throat constricted. Do you want to see him? Your grandson. Indeed. Placing Jahan on a horse-drawn litter, they took him to the barn. There he was. Chota's son, swinging his trunk, grey as a storm cloud. Jahan told the driver to take the litter closer so that he could touch the beast. Under the watchful gaze of the mother elephant, he patted the son's trunk and offered him a nut, which the animal accepted with delight. Sniffing, Panjay searched for more, smart, suspicious, spry. Jahan's eyes brimmed with tears. For an instant he had the feeling that he was staring at Chota. Something from him continued in this creature, who had never seen his father and yet was, except for his color, already so like him. They left the barn, the horse pulling lazily. As they were crossing the courtyard, Jahan caught a fragrance in the breeze that sent a signal to an obscure part of his brain. He shouted, "Stop!" They ran to his side, fearing he had been hurt. Where does this smell come from? Jahan asked. Nothing stinks around here. Lie down, snapped Balaban. One of the lads broke into a grin. I know what he's talking about. Daki Day was burning herbs. Balaban said, go get her. In a little while they brought in a woman with an upright gait and a dark mustache. She said, Chief says you wanted to see me. This thing you were burning, said Jahan. What is it? A look of annoyance crossed her face. It's called mullen. We throw it in the fire every Monday morning. And at full moon. The smoke keeps the evil spirits away. If you have enemies, you'd better boil it and take a bath in it. You want some? Tell me. Who else would use it? Other than the Romani, I mean. She gave this some thought. Those who have trouble in breathing. They carry it everywhere. People with asthma, Jahan mumbled, dismayed. He closed his eyes, the floor shifting beneath his feet. That night, as they sat around a peat fire, Balaban's wife threw salt in the flames. Embers burst like sparkles of gold. His eyes transfixed by the display. Jahan said, I should be on my way soon. Balaban nodded, expecting to hear this. When? There is one last person I need to visit. Then I am done with this city. Davud was right when he said Jahan was not a man of revenge. But he was also partly wrong. Jahan understood it wasn't only happiness that he sought in life. He also yearned for the truth.